Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly fascinating. A time of marble temples, bloody spectacle, and empire stretching across 3 continents. We're diving into what life was really like in ancient Rome. Forget the clean marble statues and noble senators Hollywood sold you. The reality is far stranger, more brutal, and infinitely more human than anything you've seen on screen. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it certainly wasn't the gleaming white city of your imagination. It was loud, it smelled, and it was painted in colours so bright they'd make a modern carnival look subtle. So before you get comfy in your bed, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, settle into your pillows, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the Forum Romanum on a summer morning in 165 AD, and the first thing that hits you isn't the grandeur, it's the smell. Thousands of unwashed bodies pressed together in the Mediterranean heat, mixed with the sharp tang of fish sauce from the food stalls, smoke from 100 cooking fires, and the unmistakable stench of the public latrines just 50 yards away. The good news is, you're in the greatest city the world has ever seen, the beating heart of an empire that controls everything from Britain to Egypt. The bad news is, you're probably going to die before you're 40, and there's a decent chance it'll be from something completely preventable, like an infected cut or contaminated water. The sun hasn't been up for more than an hour, but the Forum is already chaos. Lawyers are shouting at each other near the Basilica Julia, their voices echoing off marble columns that tower 40 feet overhead. A politician's entourage pushes through the crowd, his clients fawning and jockeying for position, hoping to be noticed by their patron. Street vendors hawk everything from hot chickpeas to stolen jewelry. Someone's cooking sausages over a brazier, the grease spitting and smoking. A religious procession winds through, priests in elaborate robes carrying something hidden under embroidered cloth, accompanied by the off-key wailing of flutes. And here's something that would shock most people. Nearly half of Rome's population of 1 million people are slaves. The man selling you bread, probably a slave. The woman carrying water, slave. The secretary taking notes for that senator, educated Greek slave worth more than a small house. The person who might kill you in the arena tomorrow for entertainment, definitely a slave. Slavery isn't some distant moral issue in Rome, it's the foundation everything else is built on, so commonplace that free Romans can't imagine their world functioning without it. But let's talk about what you probably think you know about Rome. You've seen the movies, the pristine white marble, the togas, the eloquent speeches in the Senate. Here's the truth. Those marble buildings everyone photographs today, in ancient Rome they were painted. Bright reds, deep blues, gaudy gold leaf everywhere. The statue of Marcus Aurelius that looks so dignified in weathered bronze today originally had golden reins and probably a painted face. Romans loved colour in a way that would make a modern interior designer weep. If you could time travel back, your first thought would probably be that it looks like a gaudy theme park. And those togas everyone's wearing in the movies? Most Romans never owned one. Togas were expensive, heavy, uncomfortable, and required a slave to help you put on properly. They were formal wear, the ancient equivalent of a tuxedo. You wore one to vote, to go to court, to attend important religious ceremonies. The rest of the time, you wore a tunic. Just a simple rectangle of fabric belted at the waist, usually made of wool that got incredibly hot in summer and not quite warm enough in winter. If you were poor, you owned exactly one tunic, and you wore it until it literally fell apart. Let's ground ourselves in a specific moment. It's the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the one from Gladiator, except nothing like the movie portrayed. He's actually up north right now, spending year after year fighting Germanic tribes along the Danube, sleeping in military tents, writing his meditations by candlelight while his army slowly dies of plague and exposure. That plague, by the way, the Antonine Plague, has been ravaging the empire for years. Modern historians estimate it killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. That's roughly 10% of the entire Roman Empire, dead from something that might have been smallpox or measles. There's no vaccine, no antibiotics, no real understanding of contagion beyond vague ideas about bad air. Back in Rome itself, the city sprawls across 7 hills, but it's nothing like the planned cities you're used to. The streets twist and turn with no logic, some barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Most are unpaved, just packed dirt that turns to mud when it rains and dust when it's dry. The buildings loom overhead, apartment blocks called insulae that climb 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories high. They're jerry-rigged death traps, built as cheaply as possible by landlords who live in comfortable houses elsewhere. Upper floors are accessed by external staircases, because who's going to waste valuable ground floor space on a stairwell? The higher you live, the cheaper the rent, and the more likely the entire structure will collapse on top of you, or burn to the ground in one of the frequent fires that sweep through the city. You know what doesn't exist in your apartment if you're a regular Roman? Running water. That's only for the ground floor, and even then, only if you're lucky. The famous aqueducts bring millions of gallons of fresh water into the city every day, one of Rome's genuine engineering marvels. But that water goes to public fountains, the baths, and the homes of the wealthy. Everyone else walks to the nearest fountain, which might be 3 or 4 blocks away, and carries water back in clay jars. Imagine doing that multiple times a day, every day, hauling 40 pounds of water up 5 flights of external stairs to your tiny apartment. No wonder Romans spent so much time at the public baths. It wasn't just about getting clean, it was about being somewhere with unlimited water. And speaking of the baths, let's explode another myth right now. Romans weren't particularly clean by modern standards. No matter how much time they spent bathing, they scraped oil and dirt off their skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil. They had no soap as we'd recognize it, no shampoo, no toothpaste with fluoride. Dental hygiene meant rubbing your teeth with a cloth and maybe some ground-up pumice stone. The wealthy might use urine as a whitening agent, because the ammonia actually does bleach your teeth, even as it destroys the enamel. Most Romans had terrible teeth by their 30s, if they still had teeth at all. The public baths themselves were extraordinary, though. Imagine a complex the size of several football fields, marble-clad, with hot rooms, warm rooms, cold rooms, exercise yards, libraries, and even snack bars. The Baths of Caracalla, which would be built a few decades after our moment in 165 AD, could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. The boilers underneath burned through tons of wood every day, keeping the water hot through a system of hollow floors and walls that circulated heat. Slaves stoked those furnaces in conditions that probably killed them young, but for the average Roman, the baths were paradise. For a tiny admission fee, less than you'd pay for a cup of wine, you could spend hours in heated luxury. Here's something that might surprise you. Romans bathed communally and nude, but they were weirdly prudish about certain things. A respectable woman couldn't be seen eating in public. That was too suggestive, too sensual. But getting naked in front of strangers at the baths, perfectly normal. The culture's sense of propriety would seem completely backward to modern sensibilities. Public executions where people were torn apart by animals, family entertainment, a wife going out to dinner with her husband. Scandalous. Let's talk about food, because you're probably imagining elaborate banquets with Romans reclining on couches, being fed grapes by servants. That happened, but only if you were very wealthy. Most Romans never attended a fancy dinner party in their lives. The average Roman's diet was monotonous to the point of misery. Bread, olive oil, and garum. That's it. That's most meals. Garum was fermented fish sauce, basically ancient ketchup, and Romans put it on everything because it made bland food taste like something. It was made by leaving fish guts to rot in the sun for months until they liquefied. It probably tasted similar to modern Asian fish sauces, salty and intensely savory, but the smell of the factories that made it was so overpowering that they had to be located outside city limits. If you had a little more money, you might add some porridge made from wheat or barley, some vegetables if they were in season. Meat was a luxury most Romans ate only a few times a year, during religious festivals when animals were sacrificed and the meat distributed. Chicken was more common than beef or pork, but still expensive. Fish was available if you lived near the coast or could afford what the fish merchants brought inland, packed in salt and starting to turn. You couldn't just open your refrigerator for a midnight snack in ancient Rome. There were no refrigerators. Food preservation meant salting, drying, or pickling. Milk went bad within hours in the Mediterranean heat, so Romans didn't drink much of it. They did make cheese, which lasted longer. Butter was something barbarians ate. Civilized Romans used olive oil for everything. Most Romans didn't have kitchens in their apartments. Too dangerous. One errant spark from your cooking fire, and the entire wooden building goes up, taking everyone inside with it. There were laws against cooking fires in upper-story apartments, which were routinely ignored out of necessity because people need to eat. Many Romans bought prepared food from Thermopolia, ancient fast food joints with big clay jars of hot food built into marble counters. You'd point at what you wanted, they'd ladle it into your bowl, and you'd either eat standing up or take it home. The excavated ones in Pompeii still have their painted menu signs and food residue in the jars. Scientists have analysed it. Lots of goat, lots of fish, lots of that omnipresent garum. Water was often unsafe to drink, contaminated by lead pipes and general pollution, so Romans, including children, drank wine, watered down wine, usually mixed in a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio with water. This made the water safer by killing some bacteria with the alcohol, and made the cheap, vinegary wine more palatable. Full-strength wine was considered barbaric, something only Germans and other uncivilized peoples did. Falling down drunk was socially acceptable, but drinking undiluted wine suggested you had poor self-control. Let's walk through a typical day, because that's where you really understand what life was like. You wake up at dawn, because that's when everyone wakes up. There's no electricity, so when the sun goes down, you're mostly done for the day, unless you're wealthy enough to afford lots of oil lamps or candles. Your apartment has no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters. In winter, you choose between freezing or shutting out all light. In summer, you leave them open and deal with the noise, the smell, and the insects. You eat your bread, maybe dipped in olive oil or garum. You put on your tunic, the same one you wore yesterday and will wear tomorrow. If you're a man with any social pretensions, you shave, or rather, you have someone shave you, because Roman men were generally clean-shaven, and doing it yourself with an iron razor and no shaving cream is a good way to slice your face open. If you're a woman, you spend time on your hair, because elaborate hairstyles are how you display status. The wealthy have slave hairdressers who specialize in complex curls and braids. You might have a wig made from hair imported from Germany or India. You definitely use a lot of hairpins. Then you head out into the city, into that assault of noise and smell and crowds. Rome is loud in a way that's hard to imagine. Workshops and smithies right on the street level, hammering metal, sawing wood, merchants shouting about their wares, animals everywhere, donkeys braying, chickens squawking, dogs fighting. Wagons are banned from the city streets during daylight, but that means they all come rumbling through at night, heavy iron-rimmed wheels on stone, making sleep nearly impossible. The satirist Juvenal complained that only the very rich can get sleep in Rome, because only they can afford houses set back from the street. If you have business in the Forum, you fight through the crowds to get there. If you're a client, you attend the morning salutatio, where you show up at your patron's house to pay your respects and maybe receive a small gift of food or money. This is how Roman society works. Chains of obligation running from the poorest freedman up to the emperor himself. You do favors for people above you, receive favors from people below you, vote the right way, provide political support, spread the right rumors, and in return maybe your patron will help you out of legal trouble or give your son a job. If you're a merchant, you head to your shop or stall. If you're a craftsman, to your workshop. If you're a laborer, you stand in the Forum hoping someone will hire you for the day to haul cargo or work construction. If you're a slave, you do whatever your master tells you, which could be anything from skilled accounting to backbreaking farm labor to sexual service. Being a slave in Rome is such a varied experience that generalizations barely make sense. An educated Greek slave tutoring a senator's children lives in a different universe than a slave working the fields on a Sicilian estate, who lives in a different universe than a slave working in the mines, where life expectancy is measured in months. The Roman economy runs on slave labor, but also on millions of poor free citizens struggling to survive. Many are on the grain dole, a government program that provides free bread to citizens. This isn't altruism, it's political necessity. Keep the mob fed and entertained, bread and circuses, and they won't riot. Let them go hungry, and they'll burn down the city. Roman politicians understand this equation perfectly. Around midday, everything stops for a few hours because it's simply too hot to function. This is the Mediterranean summer. Temperatures regularly hit 95 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Your wool tunic is soaked with sweat. There's no air conditioning, no cold drinks, no relief except finding shade and waiting. Many people nap. Some head to the baths early to cool off. The city quiets down, relatively speaking, though it never truly falls silent. In the afternoon, activity picks up again. This is when the wealthy conduct business, when the law courts are in session, when important meetings happen. If there are games at the Circus Maximus or the Colosseum, huge portions of the city empty out to attend. Romans are absolutely obsessed with spectacles. Chariot racing, gladiatorial combat, wild animal hunts. public executions dressed up as mythological reenactments. These aren't occasional events. They happen constantly, sometimes lasting all day, and attendance is essentially free. The emperor and wealthy magistrates pay for the games to win political favor. Let's pause on the gladiatorial games for a moment, because the reality is both more and less brutal than the movies suggest. Yes, men fought to the death in the arena. Yes, it was bloodthirsty entertainment. But gladiators were expensive, trained athletes, and killing them unnecessarily was like totaling a Ferrari for fun. Many fights ended with one man yielding and being spared. Professional gladiators could become celebrities, have fan clubs, do endorsement deals for products like ancient energy drinks made from vinegar and ash. That said, the games absolutely featured people being killed for entertainment. Condemned criminals were executed at noon, between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiatorial bouts. They were torn apart by wild animals, burned alive, crucified, or forced to fight each other with no training and minimal weapons. This was considered justice, public punishment that served as deterrent and entertainment simultaneously. The crowd ate snacks and chatted with their neighbors while watching human beings die in horrible ways. They brought their children. As the afternoon wears into evening, you might stop by the baths if you haven't already. This is social time, where you see and are seen, where you network, gossip, make deals, flirt, and generally participate in Roman public life. The baths are where class distinctions blur slightly. Everyone's naked or nearly so, though even here, the wealthy have private changing rooms with slaves to watch their clothes, while the poor risk theft from the common changing areas. By the time the sun sets, you're probably heading home, because Roman streets at night are genuinely dangerous. There's no street lighting except what spills from buildings, no organized police force, just the urban cohorts who are more focused on putting out fires than preventing crime. Muggers work the dark streets. People empty chamber pots out of upper-story windows without warning. If you're out at night, you walk in groups, carry a lamp if you can afford oil, and hope for the best. Dinner is your main meal, eaten after the baths. Again, for most Romans, this means more bread, more garum, maybe some porridge or vegetables. The wealthy recline on couches and eat elaborately prepared dishes over several courses while slaves serve them and musicians play. They might have dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, flamingo tongues, roasted peacock redressed in its feathers. The Romans who could afford it ate it in ways designed to display their wealth in the most ostentatious manner possible. Then, exhausted from a day of heat and noise and labor, you sleep on a thin mattress stuffed with straw or reeds if you're poor, maybe wool if you're doing better, under a wool blanket in winter, nothing in summer. Bedbugs are a constant problem, so are fleas and lice. You might share your bed with several family members because space is precious. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all again. But let's zoom out from the daily grind and talk about what it meant to live in Rome at its height, because understanding the city itself is crucial to understanding Roman civilization. Rome wasn't just big, it was incomprehensibly massive for the ancient world. No European city would reach Rome's population of 1 million again until London in the 19th century. This was a pre-industrial city operating at a scale that shouldn't have been possible. How did they feed 1 million people? Through an empire-wide logistics network that was genuinely impressive. Egypt sent grain by the shipload. North Africa sent olive oil. Spain sent fish sauce and wine. Goods flowed into the port of Ostia, 15 miles downriver, then up the Tiber on barges, then into warehouses, then distributed through markets and the grain dole system. When any part of this supply chain broke down, people starved. There's no modern equivalent to help you understand the precariousness. Imagine if your city's food supply depended entirely on wooden sailing ships that could be destroyed by storms, pirates, or political instability anywhere in a territory spanning 3 million square miles. The infrastructure required to keep Rome functioning was staggering. The aqueducts brought in roughly 300 gallons of water per person per day, more than most modern cities. 11 major aqueducts eventually fed the city, some stretching 60 miles from mountain springs, using gravity and precise engineering to maintain the perfect downward slope. The Aqua Claudia, completed by Emperor Claudius, featured arcades that still stand today, 46 miles of channel, with some sections running on arches nearly 100 feet tall. Building it took 14 years and untold thousands of laborers, many of them slaves. Where did all the waste go? That's a question people rarely ask, but Rome produced an enormous amount of garbage and sewage. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, drained the Forum and carried waste to the Tiber, but only wealthy houses connected to the sewer system. Most people used public latrines, communal toilets where you sat on marble benches with holes. shoulder to shoulder with strangers, doing your business while chatting about politics or the games. There was no toilet paper. You used a sponge on a stick, soaked in vinegar or salt water that everyone shared. Yes, really. Think about that next time you complain about public restrooms. The sheer amount of construction in Rome was mind-boggling. Every emperor wanted to leave his mark, building new temples, forums, baths, theatres, basilicas. The city was a permanent construction site. Marble was imported from Greece and North Africa, granite from Egypt, exotic stones from all over the empire. Sculptors, architects, engineers, and thousands of labourers constantly worked to reshape the city. The noise of construction was part of the permanent soundtrack of Roman life. Fire was an ever-present terror. In 64 AD, about 100 years before our chosen moment, the Great Fire had burned for 6 days, destroying 2/3 of the city. Nero, who may or may not have played his lyre while watching, was blamed by many, though he probably didn't start it. The fire burned hot enough to melt bronze. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were left homeless. The city rebuilt, as it always did, but fires remained common. The insulae were tinderboxes, and once a fire started in the dense urban core, it could sweep through entire neighborhoods before the vigils, the fire brigade, could contain it. Disease was another constant threat, beyond even the current Antonine plague. Malaria from the marshes around Rome, typhoid from contaminated water, dysentery from poor sanitation, tuberculosis in crowded apartments, infections from minor wounds because no one understood antiseptics, childhood diseases that killed huge percentages of children before they reached age 5. Life expectancy at birth was probably around 25 years, though if you survived childhood, you might make it to your 50s or even 60s, but that still meant half of everyone born died before adulthood. Women faced additional dangers. Childbirth killed huge numbers of women. No caesarean sections, or at least none the mother survived. No understanding of infection, or even basic hygiene. Midwives helped, but they worked with knowledge passed down through generations, some useful, some actively harmful. If something went wrong during delivery, the mother often died, the baby often died, sometimes both died. Having multiple children meant playing Russian roulette with death multiple times. Many tombstones record women who died in their 20s after having 3 or 4 children, the last birth killing them. Roman medicine was a strange mix of genuine knowledge and complete nonsense. Doctors could set broken bones reasonably well. They could perform some surgeries, even removing cataracts. They had anesthetics, though nothing like modern ones, mostly alcohol and opium-based preparations. They understood that wounds should be cleaned, even if they didn't understand why. But they also believed in the 4 humours, that disease was caused by imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They'd bleed patients to balance humours, often making them worse. They'd prescribe bizarre remedies like powdered viper or wolf liver. Some treatments worked despite the theory being wrong. Many treatments killed people who might have survived without intervention. Mental illness wasn't understood at all in any modern sense. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, all were attributed to supernatural causes, divine punishment, or humoral imbalance. Treatment might involve prayer, sacrifice, special diets, or in extreme cases being locked away. The Romans had no concept of therapy or psychiatric medication. If you experienced what we'd now recognize as severe mental illness, your life was often short and miserable. Now let's talk about slavery more directly, because you can't understand Rome without confronting this. Modern estimates suggest anywhere from 20 to 40% of Italy's population were slaves. In the city of Rome itself, the percentage was probably even higher. These weren't just agricultural laborers. Slaves did everything. They were teachers, doctors, accountants, secretaries, musicians, craftsmen, miners, prostitutes, gladiators, and domestic servants. The entire Roman economy depended on forced labor. How did someone become a slave? Most commonly, by being captured in war. Rome's constant military expansion meant a steady supply of war captives sold into slavery. Pirates also captured and sold people. Some people were born into slavery, children of slave mothers. Some people sold themselves into slavery to escape debt, though this was theoretically temporary. Children could be sold by desperate parents, or simply abandoned as infants to die or be picked up by slave dealers. The slave markets were filled with human misery. What was life like as a slave? That depended entirely on who owned you and what work you did. Urban domestic slaves of wealthy families often had bearable lives, at least by ancient standards. They had food, shelter, clothing. They might be treated relatively well, considered part of the household. Skilled slaves like teachers or secretaries were valuable and less likely to be abused because damaging your investment made no sense. These slaves could sometimes save money and eventually buy their freedom, but agricultural slaves on large estates lived nightmare existences. They worked from dawn to dusk doing back-breaking labor, fed minimal rations, housed in barracks, often kept in chains. They could be beaten, tortured, or killed at their master's whim. If they tried to run, they were branded on the face or killed as an example. The mines were worse. Slaves sent to the mines usually died within a year from exhaustion, malnutrition, or accidents. It was essentially a death sentence. Sexual slavery was common and accepted. Masters had absolute rights over their slaves' bodies. Male and female slaves could be raped without legal consequence. Some slaves were kept specifically for sexual purposes. The power imbalance was total, and there was no recourse, no one to complain to, no protection. This was legal, normal, barely worth commenting on in Roman literature, except as a point of amusement or titillation. Yet Rome also had a high rate of manumission, slaves being freed. Masters might free slaves in their wills, or as reward for good service, or because they'd saved enough to buy their freedom. Freed slaves, liberti, became Roman citizens, though with some restrictions. Their children were full citizens. This meant Roman society included many people who'd been slaves, or whose parents had been slaves. Some became quite wealthy and powerful. The emperor's own household included many freedmen in important administrative positions. This creates a moral complexity that's uncomfortable. The Romans practiced slavery on a massive scale with casual cruelty. They also had systems that allowed slaves to sometimes improve their situations and even achieve freedom. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither excuses the fundamental horror of treating human beings as property. The legal system that governed all of this, slave and free alike, was remarkably sophisticated in some ways and shockingly arbitrary in others. Roman law would eventually become the foundation for most Western legal systems, but living under it as an ordinary Roman was a very different experience from reading about it in a law school textbook. If you were wealthy, the law protected you extensively. You could hire skilled lawyers, you had connections with magistrates, you understood the system. If you were poor, the law was something that happened to you, usually not in a good way. Trials were public spectacles held in the forum or in the basilicas, those large public buildings with colonnades. There were no courtrooms in the modern sense. A magistrate would set up in a prominent location, crowds would gather, and the trial would proceed with everyone watching and commenting. If you were accused of a crime, you didn't have a right to a lawyer, though you could hire one if you had money. The prosecution and defense would give speeches, present witnesses, appeal to emotion as much as to law. Rhetoric mattered enormously. A skilled orator could convince a jury of almost anything. And yes, there were juries, but not like modern ones. For serious criminal cases, juries could be huge, sometimes more than 50 people, drawn from the property-owning classes. They didn't deliberate in private. They just voted, usually by dropping marked tablets into urns. Simple majority decided guilt or innocence. No appeals in the modern sense, though you could sometimes get a retrial if you had the right connections. If you were found guilty of a capital crime and you were a citizen, you had the option of going into voluntary exile before sentencing, which many wealthy Romans did. If you were poor or a slave, you were executed, often in creative and horrible ways designed to serve as public deterrent. Torture was routine in the legal system, but mostly for slaves. A slave's testimony was only considered valid in court if it was given under torture, based on the assumption that slaves would lie to protect their masters unless they were in too much pain to think strategically. This tells you something about how Romans thought about truth and humanity. Free citizens couldn't be tortured, at least not legally, though there were ways around that if someone powerful wanted information from you. The whole system operated on the assumption that different types of people deserved different treatment under law. Crucifixion, that method of execution Romans are infamous for, was specifically reserved for slaves and non-citizens. It was designed to be as prolonged and humiliating as possible. You'd be stripped naked, beaten, forced to carry the crossbeam to the execution site, then nailed or tied to the cross and left to hang until you died of exposure, dehydration, or eventually suffocation as your muscles gave out. It could take days. The Romans crucified thousands of people, lining roads with crosses as warnings. After the slave revolt led by Spartacus was crushed in 71 BC, 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, one crucifixion every 40 yards for 120 miles. The crosses stayed up until the bodies rotted and fell apart. Citizens could be executed too, but usually by beheading, which was relatively quick and private. Let's shift to something less grim. Religion in Rome was everywhere, woven into every aspect of daily life, but it was nothing like modern religious practice. Romans were polytheistic, believing in dozens of major gods and hundreds of minor ones. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Neptune. You know the names from mythology class. But Roman religion was fundamentally transactional. You made offerings and sacrifices to the gods, and in return you expected them to deliver favorable outcomes. It was a business relationship. Piety meant performing the rituals correctly, not having sincere faith or moral virtue in any Christian sense. Every household had a lararium, a small shrine to the household gods, the lares and penates. You'd make small offerings there daily, asking for protection and prosperity. The state religion involved massive public ceremonies. Priests would sacrifice animals, usually sheep, pigs or cattle, on altars outside temples. The animal would be killed, its organs examined for omens, then most of the meat would be cooked and distributed to the crowd. This was one of the few times poor Romans ate meat regularly. Temples weren't like churches or synagogues where congregations gathered for services. They were houses for the gods, and the general public couldn't enter the inner sanctum where the cult statue stood. You worshipped outside, at the altar in front of the temple. The interior was for priests only, and Roman priests weren't moral authorities or spiritual guides. They were ritual specialists, often aristocrats who held priesthoods as political positions. Being a priest meant you knew the proper procedures for sacrificing to a particular god, not that you had any special personal relationship with the divine. The Romans were genuinely afraid of angering the gods through improper ritual. If a priest stumbled over a word during a ceremony, the entire sacrifice might be declared void and have to be repeated. When Rome suffered disasters, military defeats, plagues, earthquakes, one response was to review whether all religious rituals were being performed correctly. The gods must be angry about something. Better make more sacrifices, build more temples, be more careful about the rituals. This could provide comfort in the face of random catastrophe. It's not meaningless suffering. The gods are displeased, and there are actions we can take to fix it. As the empire expanded, Romans encountered other gods and religions, and they mostly just added them to their existing pantheon. Isis from Egypt became popular in Rome. Mithras from Persia had a significant cult. The Romans were religiously tolerant, as long as you also paid respect to the Roman gods, and increasingly to the divine emperor. That's where Christians ran into problems. Christians refused to make sacrifices to the emperor, which Romans saw as treason, not religious persecution. You can believe whatever you want, Romans thought, but you still have to participate in state religion. It's civic duty, not theology. Speaking of the emperor, by 165 AD, the position has evolved into something between a god and a military dictator. Augustus, the first emperor, had carefully maintained the fiction that he was just the first citizen, the princeps, and that the republic still technically existed. By Marcus Aurelius's time, nobody's pretending anymore. The emperor has absolute power. The Senate still exists, but is mostly advisory. Real decisions are made by the emperor and his inner circle. The emperor is worshipped as a living god in the provinces, and as a future god in Rome itself. When an emperor dies, the Senate votes on whether to deify him, though this is largely a formality if he was popular or if his successor wants him deified. If you're a provincial, you participate in the imperial cult, making sacrifices to the emperor's genius, his divine spirit, at temples built specifically for emperor worship. This is how the empire maintains cohesion across vast distances and different cultures. Shared worship of the emperor creates common identity. But here's something that would surprise most people. Emperors could be incredibly unpopular and still maintain power through military support. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military force stationed in Rome, made and unmade emperors. If the guard decided they didn't like the current emperor, they'd assassinate him and auction off the position to whoever offered them the biggest bonus, multiple times. In 193 AD, a few decades after our moment, the Praetorian Guard would literally murder the Emperor Pertinax, and then sell the imperial throne to a senator named Didius Julianus, who promised each guardsman 25,000 sesterces. He ruled for 66 days before being overthrown and executed by a rival who had actual army support. The military was the real power in the empire, and everyone knew it. Rome maintained about 30 legions, roughly 150,000 heavy infantry, plus an equal number of auxiliary troops drawn from non-citizen populations. These men were professionals, serving for 20 to 25 years. If you were a citizen and joined a legion, you were signing up for a hard life, but one with real benefits. Regular pay, food, equipment, medical care better than most civilians received, and upon retirement, a pension and land grant. Many poor Romans saw military service as their best path to stability. Life as a legionary was brutal, though. You marched everywhere carrying about 60 pounds of gear, armor, weapons, tools, cooking equipment, personal items, several days' worth of rations. 20 miles a day was standard, sometimes more if you were chasing an enemy or rushing to relieve a siege. You dug fortified camps every single night, even if you were just stopping for one evening. Every legion traveling through hostile territory would construct a complete temporary fort with walls, ditches, gates, and internal layouts following standard plans. This took hours of back-breaking labor at the end of a full day's march, and you'd dismantle it all the next morning. Combat was terrifying in ways modern soldiers with rifles and body armor can barely imagine. You fought shoulder to shoulder in formation, close enough to smell your enemy. You stabbed with your gladius, a short sword designed for thrusting, trying to punch through armor and into vital organs. You blocked with your scutum, your big rectangular shield. Men screamed, bled, died inches from your face. If the formation broke, you were probably dead. Unit cohesion was everything. That's why discipline was so harsh and training so relentless. Discipline in the legions could be horrifying. Minor infractions got you beaten. Serious crimes got you executed, sometimes via fustuarium, being beaten to death by your fellow soldiers. If an entire unit deserted or showed cowardice, decimation might be ordered. Every 10th man would be selected by lottery and killed by the other 9 in his squad. This was rare, but the fact that it was even an option tells you about Roman military culture. The army functioned on fear as much as esprit de corps. Yet legionaries also developed intense loyalty to their units and their commanders. You spent years or decades fighting beside the same men. You shared everything: danger, boredom, victories, defeats, the long grinding tedium of garrison duty. Successful generals inspired fanatical devotion. Julius Caesar's men loved him so much they'd follow him into civil war against Rome itself. That's how the Republic ended. Armies loyal to generals rather than to the state, and generals willing to march on Rome if it served their ambitions. Let's talk about childhood in Rome, because that's another area where modern assumptions fall apart. If you survived infancy, which plenty of children didn't, your childhood was probably short and not particularly innocent. Children were expected to start contributing economically as soon as they were able. Poor children worked. Wealthy children studied, which was its own kind of work. There was no concept of letting kids be kids for their own sake. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps 30% of babies died in their first year. Another 20 to 30% died before age 10. Diseases we can now prevent with simple vaccines killed enormous numbers of children. Malnutrition, accidents. The reasons were endless. If you were a Roman parent, you had to steel yourself for the likelihood that some of your children wouldn't survive. Funerary inscriptions for young children are heartbreaking, but they're also common enough to be routine. Infanticide and infant exposure were legal and socially acceptable. If a baby was born deformed, sickly, or simply unwanted, the father could refuse to acknowledge it. The infant would be taken outside the city and left to die of exposure or be picked up by slave dealers. Baby girls were exposed more often than boys because they were seen as economic burdens who would need dowries. This happened regularly enough that there was a noticeable gender imbalance in the population. It's hard to know exact numbers, but historians estimate that between 10 and 40% of newborns might have been exposed, though many may have been rescued and raised as slaves or foundlings. If you were accepted into the family, your childhood depended entirely on your social class. Wealthy children had tutors, usually educated Greek slaves. They learned to read and write both Latin and Greek, studied literature and rhetoric, learned math and sometimes basic science. Girls from wealthy families received education too, though usually not as extensively as their brothers, and focused more on skills deemed appropriate for managing a household. Poor children got little or no formal education. There were no public schools in the modern sense. If your parents could afford a few coins, you might attend a small private school where a teacher drilled students in basic literacy and numeracy. Classes were held in rented spaces or just outside in the forum, with students sitting on benches or the ground. The teacher beat students who couldn't answer questions correctly. Physical punishment was considered essential to learning. Children wore a special amulet called a bulla, a locket containing protective charms, until they came of age. Boys had a ceremony around age 14 where they dedicated their bulla to the household gods and put on the toga virilis, the toga of manhood. Girls came of age earlier, usually around 12, when they were considered ready for marriage. Yes, 12. Roman girls from good families were often married shortly after puberty to men significantly older. The marriage was arranged by the fathers, and the girl's consent wasn't legally required. Marriage in Rome was fundamentally a property arrangement between families. Love might develop, but it wasn't the point. The point was political alliances, combining wealth, producing legitimate heirs. Divorce was easy and common among the upper classes. Either spouse could initiate divorce simply by declaring the marriage over, though property settlements could get complicated. A divorced woman would return to her father's household with her dowry, unless she'd done something scandalous enough that the dowry could be kept. Women's lives in Rome are hard to characterize briefly because class made such a huge difference. Wealthy women couldn't vote or hold office, but they could own property, conduct business, and exercise significant informal power through their families. They attended dinner parties, went to the baths, saw the games, participated in religious ceremonies. They had more social freedom than women in some other ancient societies, like Athens, where respectable women rarely left the house. Poor women worked. They sold goods in markets, worked in shops, labored in workshops. Some became prostitutes by necessity. Prostitution was legal and common, though not respectable. The state taxed prostitutes and regulated brothels. The prostitutes themselves had no legal protections to speak of. Many were slaves who had no choice in the matter. Some were freed women or poor citizens doing what they had to do to survive. One detail that shocks modern audiences: Roman men could legally have sex with male slaves with no social stigma, and relationships between free men and younger free males were acknowledged, though with complex social rules about who penetrated whom and what that meant for your masculinity. Roman sexuality was less about gender and more about power, status, and the active versus passive role. Being the penetrative partner was fine. Being the receptive partner, especially as a free adult citizen male, was shameful. Women's sexuality was much more restricted and controlled because female chastity, or at least the appearance of it, mattered for inheritance and family honor. Let's move to one of Rome's most spectacular aspects: the architecture. You've probably seen pictures of the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts. These buildings are genuinely impressive, but photographs don't convey the scale or the context. The Colosseum, still under construction during parts of our chosen time period, was a gift from the Flavian emperors to the Roman people, built on the site where Nero had constructed his grotesquely opulent palace. It could seat 50,000 people and fill or empty in minutes through a sophisticated system of staircases and passages. The floor of the arena could be flooded for mock naval battles, then drained. Under the floor was a complex system of tunnels, lifts and cages, where animals and gladiators waited before being raised into the arena through trapdoors. The Pantheon, completed under Hadrian, featured a dome that was the largest in the world and would remain so for more than 1,000 years. The engineering required to build it was extraordinary. The concrete dome is still the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. Romans invented concrete, or at least a version of it using volcanic ash that could set underwater and was incredibly durable. Much of Roman concrete has outlasted modern concrete, which is humbling for our supposedly advanced civilization. Roman engineering showed up in less glamorous but more important ways too. The road network spanned more than 50,000 miles of paved highways connecting Rome to every province. These weren't crude tracks. They were sophisticated constructions with drainage systems, multiple layers of materials, and standardized widths. Many Roman roads are still in use today, buried under modern pavement, following the same routes engineers planned 2,000 years ago. The roads enabled everything else: military movement, trade, communication, cultural exchange. The saying "all roads lead to Rome" was literally true for a significant portion of the known world. Bridges and tunnels showcased Roman engineering at its best. The Pont du Gard in southern France is a three-tiered aqueduct bridge that still stands, carrying water across a valley on arches, 160 feet tall. Roman engineers built tunnels through mountains, sometimes miles long, to carry water or roads. The mining techniques they developed, including using fire to crack rock and water to flush away debris, were brutally effective. The environmental damage from Roman mining operations was visible in ice cores from Greenland, showing lead pollution from Roman silver mining operations. But living among all this impressive infrastructure didn't mean your daily life was comfortable. Most Romans never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Rome itself was spectacular, but step outside the city, and you're in a rural world that hasn't changed much in centuries. Most of the empire's population lived in small agricultural communities, farming the same land their ancestors had farmed, using the same tools and techniques. Life in a provincial village was hard. monotonous, and short. If you were a farmer, and most people were, your life revolved around the seasons and the endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting. You worked from dawn to dusk most days. You owned little beyond your tools, clothes, and maybe some furniture. Your house was small, probably 1 or 2 rooms, with a dirt floor and a thatched roof. You had no books, because you couldn't read anyway. Entertainment was seasonal festivals and gossip. The highlight of your year might be going to the nearest town for market day. Your diet was even more monotonous than a city dweller's. Grain porridge or bread, whatever vegetables you could grow, maybe some cheese or eggs if you had animals. Meat once or twice a year at festivals. You drank water from the local stream or well, which was probably contaminated with agricultural runoff and parasites, giving you chronic low-level dysentery that you'd just live with because everyone had it. You'd wear the same wool tunic year-round, patching it when it tore until it was more patch than original fabric. Medical care in the countryside was essentially non-existent. If you got seriously ill or injured, you'd probably die. There might be a local healer who knew some herbs and folk remedies, and occasionally those worked, but often they didn't. Breaking a leg could mean lifelong disability or death from infection. A difficult childbirth meant the woman died. A bad harvest meant everyone went hungry. And the weakest children, elderly, the already sick might starve. Yet there was also a simplicity and community structure that city dwellers lacked. You knew everyone in your village. You helped each other with harvests and building projects. Your family lived nearby, multiple generations in the same small area. You worshipped at the same local shrines your great-grandparents had used. Life was hard and often short, but it had a rhythm and a social fabric that gave it meaning. The empire maintained control over all these far-flung communities through a system that was remarkably efficient given the technology available. Provincial governors, appointed by the emperor or elected by the Senate depending on the province, administered Roman law and collected taxes. These governors had enormous power and many used it to enrich themselves spectacularly. Some were conscientious administrators, many were corrupt. If you were a provincial living under a particularly greedy governor, you might find yourself taxed into poverty while he retired to Rome with a fortune. Tax collection was often farmed out to publicani, private contractors who paid the state a fixed amount and then collected whatever they could from the population, keeping the difference as profit. This created incentive for aggressive overtaxation. The publicani were universally hated. Jesus' disciples included a tax collector, and contemporaries saw this as Jesus associating with the absolute dregs of society, collaborators who enriched themselves by squeezing money from their own people. The army kept order and defended borders, but it also acted as a drain on local economies. Soldiers needed to be fed, equipped, housed. Communities near military bases had to provide supplies, labor, and often sexual services to the troops. The presence of the legions could be as much burden as protection, especially during civil wars when armies loyal to different commanders would march back and forth across provinces, looting and requisitioning supplies. Still, Roman citizenship was valuable enough that many non-Romans sought it. Citizens had legal protections, couldn't be crucified, could appeal to the emperor in legal cases, and had access to the grain dole if they lived in Rome. Citizenship could be earned through military service, purchased if you had enough money, or granted by the emperor for various services. Over time, Roman citizenship expanded, and in 212 AD, the emperor Caracalla would grant citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This was partly about tax revenue. Citizens paid different taxes, but it also reflected how Roman identity had become less about ethnicity and more about participation in Roman culture and law. Trade flowed along Roman roads and sea lanes, creating an economy that was genuinely globalized for its time. Goods from China reached Rome via the Silk Road. Spices from India were sold in Roman markets. Wine from Spain and Gaul was shipped across the Mediterranean. Grain from Egypt fed Rome and other cities. Glass, pottery, metalwork, textiles, olive oil, garum. Everything was produced somewhere and transported elsewhere. Merchants could become extremely wealthy, though they occupied an ambiguous social position. Old aristocratic families looked down on trade as beneath them, even as some quietly invested in commercial ventures through freedmen intermediaries. Money itself was interesting. Rome had a sophisticated monetary system with gold auri, silver denarii, brass sesterces, and copper asses. The coins showed the emperor's face and various propaganda images. People understood and used money daily, unlike in some earlier ancient societies where most transactions were still barter. But the money supply was limited by the availability of precious metals, and emperors sometimes debased the coinage, reducing the silver content to stretch resources which caused inflation. Banking existed in a primitive form. You could deposit money with an argentarius, a banker, who might lend it out at interest. Interest rates could be extortionate, and defaulting on loans could mean slavery. Financial crashes happened when multiple lenders failed simultaneously, and since there was no central bank or deposit insurance, people just lost everything. The economy lurched from boom to bust, with no real understanding of economics in any modern sense or tools to manage the cycles. Let's talk about fashion and appearance in more detail, because Romans cared about this intensely. Your clothing and grooming signaled your status to everyone you encountered, and Romans were hyper-aware of social hierarchy. Togas, as we discussed, were formal wear, and there were specific types. The toga virilis was plain white wool. The toga praetexta had a purple stripe and was worn by magistrates and freeborn boys. Senators wore togas with a broad purple stripe. The triumphata, a general celebrating a victory, wore a solid purple toga and had his face painted red for the ceremony. Putting on a toga required help and skill. The fabric was huge, semicircular, and had to be draped in precise folds. You couldn't move your left arm much when wearing one properly. They were hot, heavy, and impractical, which was exactly the point. Wearing a toga showed you didn't do manual labor. You were important enough to attend public business, wealthy enough to own formal clothing, and successful enough to have slaves to dress you. For daily wear, though, even wealthy Romans wore tunics. Just better quality tunics made of finer wool or linen, sometimes silk if you were very rich. Women's clothing was similarly complex. The basic garment was the stola, a long dress worn over a tunic. Married women wore a special hairstyle and covered their heads with a palla, a rectangular shawl, when outside. Prostitutes weren't allowed to wear the stola and had to wear togas, which on women marked them as sexually available. Color mattered. Purple dye was expensive because it came from murex snails, requiring thousands of snails for a small amount of dye. Wearing purple showed wealth. Bright colors generally showed status, while the poor wore undyed wool in off-white, brown, or grey. Jewelry was important for those who could afford it. Gold rings indicated equestrian or senatorial rank. Fibulae, decorative pins that held clothing together, ranged from simple bronze to elaborate gold and gemstone pieces. Wealthy women wore necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and hair ornaments. Cameos and intaglios carved from semi-precious stones were popular. Pearls from the Red Sea and Indian Ocean were especially prized. The Emperor Caligula, notorious for his excesses, reportedly spent millions on a single dinner party, where guests wore pearl-encrusted clothing just to show off. Grooming standards were rigid, especially for the upper classes. Men were expected to be clean-shaven, which meant regular trips to the tunsa, the barber. Barbershops were social hubs where men gathered to gossip and hear news. The barber used an iron razor without any shaving cream, just water or oil, scraping the blade across your face while you tried not to flinch. Nicks and cuts were inevitable. Many men had their faces covered in small scars from years of shaving. Some applied spider webs to cuts to stop bleeding, which sometimes worked because spider webs contain compounds that promote clotting, and sometimes gave you an infection. Women dealt with body hair through various methods, all of them unpleasant. Plucking with tweezers made of bronze or iron. Depilatory creams made from quicklime and arsenic that chemically burned the hair off and frequently damaged the skin. Some women just used pumice stones to abrade the hair away, which was painful and left you raw. The aesthetic standard called for smooth, hairless skin on women, and achieving it was agonizing. Cosmetics were common among women who could afford them. White lead powder for pale skin, which slowly poisoned you. Rouge made from red ochre or wine dregs. Coal eyeliner made from soot and antimony. Lipstick from crushed mulberries or red ochre mixed with fat. These cosmetics weren't subtle. They were meant to be obvious, transforming your appearance into something artificial and striking. The pale skin was especially prized because it showed you didn't work outdoors. Tanned skin meant you were a laborer or a slave. Hair was an art form for wealthy women. They might spend hours having slaves style their hair into elaborate towers of curls, or wear wigs made from hair imported from Germania or India. Blonde hair was particularly fashionable, so women used various mixtures to bleach their dark hair lighter, many of which damaged the hair until it broke off. Some women just wore blonde wigs and accepted that everyone knew it was fake. Men's hairstyles were simpler, but emperors set trends. When an emperor had curly hair, suddenly everyone wanted curls. When he went bald, suddenly being bald was distinguished. The calendar Romans used is still with us, though they'd find our version very strange. They named months after gods and emperors. July and August were July and August because Julius Caesar and Augustus renamed them after themselves. The Romans counted days backward from 3 fixed points each month: the calends first of the month, the nones 5th or 7th, and the ides 13th or 15th. So instead of saying March 15th, they'd say the Ides of March, which is why everyone remembers that as the day Caesar was assassinated. Time during the day was measured imprecisely. Sundials worked when the sun was out, but were only rough guides. Water clocks existed but were expensive and not particularly accurate. Most people tracked time by the sun's position and divided the day into broader chunks: first light, morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night. That was precise enough for most purposes. If you had an appointment, you'd arrange to meet in the morning or the afternoon, not at a specific hour and minute. The concept of being 5 minutes late didn't exist. You were vaguely on time, or noticeably late, and nobody was wearing a watch to prove otherwise. Death was everywhere in Roman society, visible and acknowledged in ways modern people find disturbing. Infant mortality we've covered, but death rates remained high throughout life. If you made it to 10, you might make it to 50, but probably not much beyond. People died from diseases we can now cure with antibiotics, from infections we'd treat with antiseptics, from injuries that modern surgery could repair, from cancers that might now be treatable, from strokes and heart attacks with no understanding of what was happening or how to help. Funeral practices varied by class, as everything did. The wealthy had elaborate funeral processions through the city, with professional mourners wailing and tearing their hair, musicians playing, actors wearing death masks representing the ancestors, the whole spectacle designed to display the family's status and grief. The body would be cremated on a pyre piled with expensive incense and perfumes. The ashes would be collected in an urn and placed in a family tomb along the roads outside the city. Roman law forbade burial inside city limits for health reasons, so major roads leading out of Rome were lined with tombs and monuments. The poor had simpler funerals, but still funeral clubs, collegia, where members paid small regular dues, and in return received a proper burial when they died. This was important. Romans believed the dead needed proper funeral rites to rest peacefully. A body left unburied was horrifying, condemned to wander as a restless spirit. Even executed criminals were sometimes given to their families for burial. After major battles, both sides would typically arrange truces to collect and bury or burn their dead. Tombstones and monuments give us direct voices from the past, and they're remarkably human. Parents mourning children who died young, spouses praising each other, slaves grateful to masters who freed them, people recording their accomplishments, their trades, their jokes. You wonder if that was true or just what you're supposed to say. Ghost stories and superstitions permeated Roman culture. They believed in all sorts of supernatural creatures: lemures, malevolent spirits of the dead; larvae, ghosts who died violently; daimons, the deified spirits of ancestors who needed regular offerings. They performed rituals to ward off evil, kept amulets for protection, paid attention to omens and portents. A bird flying in an unusual pattern might mean something significant. A sneeze at the wrong moment could ruin a business deal. Spilling salt required specific countermeasures to avoid bad luck. Magic and curses were taken seriously. You could pay someone to write a curse tablet, a piece of lead inscribed with spells asking gods or spirits to harm your enemy. These tablets have been found in wells and tombs across the Roman world, cursing romantic rivals, business competitors, chariot drivers from opposing racing teams. Divination was practiced at every level of society. Wealthy families consulted augurs, priests who interpreted the flight patterns of birds and the behavior of sacred chickens. The army wouldn't begin a campaign without taking the auspices, checking whether the gods approved. If the chickens wouldn't eat their feed, that was a bad omen. Sometimes generals who were determined to fight anyway would just get new chickens or announce the chickens had been enthusiastic about their breakfast regardless of reality. The gods surely wouldn't notice that part. Education for those who could afford it emphasized rhetoric above all else. Being able to speak persuasively in public was essential for any political or legal career. Students memorized Homer and Virgil, learned to construct arguments, practiced delivering speeches on hypothetical topics. They'd argue both sides to develop flexibility, grammar, logic, some mathematics, a bit of philosophy for the well-educated. But the core was rhetoric, the ability to make your case convincingly. Literature and poetry flourished in Rome, though much of what was written has been lost. We have Virgil's Aeneid, the epic poem commissioned by Augustus to give Rome a mythological origin story connecting them to the Trojan War. We have Ovid's Metamorphoses, erotic poetry, and his poems from exile after he offended Augustus somehow, probably by witnessing something scandalous in the imperial family. We have Horace's odes, Juvenal's bitter satires, Martial's witty and often obscene epigrams. What we don't have is most of what was written. Perhaps 90% of classical literature is lost, destroyed when libraries burned, when scrolls decayed, when later ages decided certain texts weren't worth copying. Books themselves were expensive and rare. They were scrolls, not codices with pages. You'd read by unrolling the scroll with one hand while rolling it back up with the other, which was awkward and limited how quickly you could reference different sections. The codex, the book with pages you could flip through, was just starting to become common, primarily among Christians who found it more practical for referencing scripture. Each book had to be copied by hand, a laborious process that introduced errors with every copying. Libraries existed in major cities, some public, some private. The library at Alexandria in Egypt was the most famous, containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls until it burned in various incidents. Exactly when and how remains debated among historians. Most Romans never read a book in their lives. Literacy rates were probably around 20 to 30% for men, much lower for women, and highly concentrated in cities and the upper classes. If you couldn't read, you relied on public readings, word of mouth, oral tradition. Important news was posted in the forum on whitewashed boards. Town criers announced decrees. If you needed to send a letter, you dictated it to a scribe. If you received one, you had someone read it to you. This meant privacy was nearly impossible for the illiterate, which was most people. Entertainment beyond the games took various forms. Theatre was popular, though Roman theatre was different from Greek. They preferred comedies and farces to tragedies. Mime performances, which could be obscene and included female performers, drew big crowds. Pantomime, where a single performer acted out a story through dance and gesture while a chorus sang the narrative, became hugely popular. These performers could become celebrities, and audiences would riot when their favorites were snubbed or competing performers were favored. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus was even more popular than gladiatorial games. The circus could hold 150,000 people, and races happened frequently. 4 teams competed: the blues, greens, reds and whites, and Romans were fanatical about their teams. You'd support your colour from childhood, attend every race, bet heavily on the outcomes. Successful charioteers were superstars who earned enormous amounts of money. One charioteer, Diocles, retired after a career where he reportedly won races worth 35 million sesterces in prize money. That's equivalent to the pay of an entire legion for an entire year. The races themselves were dangerous and exciting. 12 laps around a track a quarter-mile long, 7 chariots competing, crashes common. Charioteers wrapped the reins around their bodies for better control, which meant if they crashed, they could be dragged to death unless they cut themselves free with a knife they kept in their belts. Horses were celebrities too, with pedigrees tracked and preferred bloodlines developed. Winning horses might be commemorated with monuments when they died. Music was part of Roman life, though we'll never know exactly what it sounded like because their musical notation system was rudimentary and much wasn't written down at all. They had various instruments: the tibia, a double-piped wind instrument similar to an oboe; the cassera, a large lyre; the tuba, a long straight trumpet; drums and cymbals and tambourines. Music accompanied religious ceremonies, theatrical performances, military marches, private parties. Street musicians played for coins. Wealthy families had slave musicians who performed at dinners. Gambling was technically illegal but universally practiced. Romans bet on everything: chariot races, gladiatorial outcomes, dice games, board games, animal fights. Loaded dice have been found in archaeological sites, proving cheating was as common then as now. Taverns and bars were centers of gambling, drinking and prostitution. Respectable people weren't supposed to frequent such places, but plenty did anyway. The Emperor Claudius wrote a book about dice gambling, though he was generally considered an embarrassment to imperial dignity before he surprised everyone by being a reasonably competent emperor. Alcohol consumption was high across all social levels. Wine was the standard drink, varying from barely drinkable vinegar for the poor to sophisticated aged vintages for the wealthy. Romans developed appellations, specific regions known for quality wine. Falernian wine from Campania was especially prized. They understood that wine improved with age, up to a point, and some wines were stored for decades. They also flavored wine with honey, herbs and spices, creating drinks we'd find strange. Mulsum, wine mixed with honey, was served as an aperitif. Getting drunk was socially acceptable at dinner parties, which could last for hours. You'd recline on couches arranged in a U-shape around tables, with slaves bringing course after course. The food at elite banquets was deliberately exotic and excessive, not just roast meat, but complicated dishes designed to show off the cook's skill and the host's wealth. Birds stuffed inside other birds, sauces made from rare ingredients, dishes that looked like one thing but were actually another. The host might present a cooked boar and then have hunters rush in with spears to kill it, at which point they'd slice it open and live birds would fly out. Subtlety was not the goal. The conversation at these dinners was as important as the food, discussing philosophy, politics, literature, and gossip, reciting poetry, telling stories, engaging in wit. This was networking, socializing, displaying your cultural sophistication. If you wanted to advance socially or politically, you needed invitations to the right dinner parties. Who you dined with mattered as much as what you ate. Across all this daily life, the reality of empire pressed constantly. Rome controlled a territory stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, and that control required constant maintenance. Rebellions had to be suppressed, borders had to be defended, governors had to extract taxes, the military machine had to be fed and supplied. The whole system was precarious, balanced on military might, economic exploitation, and the fiction that Roman rule benefited everyone. The provinces had different experiences of Roman rule. Some regions, like parts of Gaul and Spain, were thoroughly Romanized, adopting Latin, Roman law, Roman architecture, and Roman culture. Cities in these areas looked like miniature Romes, with forums, bathhouses, amphitheaters, and temples. Local elites sent their children to Rome for education and sought Roman citizenship as a path to power. After a few generations, these populations considered themselves Roman. Other regions remained more resistant. Judea, for instance, never fully accepted Roman rule. The Jewish population found Roman polytheism and emperor worship fundamentally incompatible with their monotheistic religion. The Romans, who were generally religiously tolerant, kept making exceptions for Jewish practices, but tensions remained high. Revolts would eventually lead to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD and the disastrous Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s, after which the Romans essentially tried to erase Jewish presence from the region, renaming it Syria-Palestina. Carta 1 Egypt was treated as essentially the emperor's personal property, a special case administered directly by the emperor through a prefect rather than through the normal provincial system. Egypt's grain fed Rome, and its wealth was staggering. The Ptolemaic pharaohs had accumulated vast riches, and those flowed to Rome after Augustus conquered it in 30 BC following the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. No senator was even allowed to visit Egypt without imperial permission, because controlling Egypt meant controlling Rome's food supply, and that was too much power to let anyone else have. Britain was a strange case, conquered under Claudius in 43 AD, and never fully pacified. The Romans controlled the south, and built cities, roads, and villas there. Londinium became a significant trading centre, but the north remained troubled, with constant warfare against tribes beyond the frontier. Hadrian would eventually build his famous wall across northern England, a physical statement that here was the edge of civilization, and beyond lay barbarism. The wall still stands in places, a monument to the limits of Roman power. The Rhine and Danube rivers formed much of Rome's northern frontier, and beyond them lay Germania, a vast forested region full of tribes the Romans considered barbarians. The Romans had tried to conquer Germania, and the disaster in 9 AD when Varus lost 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest remained a trauma in Roman memory. The Romans never recovered those eagles, the legionary standards that represented the unit's honor and spirit. So instead of conquering Germania, Rome fortified the frontier and tried to manage the tribes through a combination of trade, bribery, and intimidation. Germanic warriors could be recruited as auxiliary troops, serving Rome for pay and citizenship. Some Germanic nobles were educated in Rome and became Romanized, but the frontier remained militarized and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance and significant military resources. Trade with peoples beyond the empire flourished despite the military tensions. Roman goods reached Scandinavia, the Baltic, deep into Africa, and far into Asia. Amber from the Baltic was prized for jewelry. Ivory from Africa became furniture inlay. Silk from China was worth its weight in gold, transported along the Silk Road through countless intermediaries. Romans never directly contacted China, and Chinese never directly contacted Rome. though each knew the other existed through merchants and travelers. They called China Serica, the land of silk. The cost of maintaining the empire was staggering. The army alone consumed perhaps 3/4 of the imperial budget. Infrastructure projects like aqueducts and roads cost fortunes. The grain dole fed hundreds of thousands. The games and festivals cost enormous amounts, though they were technically paid for by emperors and wealthy magistrates rather than the state directly, a distinction that blurred since emperors were expected to be generous and magistrates sought popularity. How did Rome pay for all this? Taxes, plunder, and careful economic exploitation. The provinces paid tribute, essentially protection money, to avoid being looted by the legions. Mines in Spain and elsewhere extracted gold, silver, copper, and iron. Agricultural estates produced grain, wine, and olive oil for export. Trade tariffs brought in revenue. The whole system worked as long as Rome kept expanding, bringing in new wealth and new tax bases. When expansion stopped, when Rome reached natural boundaries and frontiers that were too expensive to push further, the economic model became more precarious. By our moment in 165 AD, the expansion has essentially ended. Marcus Aurelius fights in the north not to conquer new territory, but to defend existing borders. The Antonine Plague has killed millions and disrupted the economy. The military is stretched thin. Cracks are appearing in the system, though it will take centuries for them to widen into fatal flaws. The empire will persist in some form for another 300 years in the west, 1500 years in the east as Byzantium, but the golden age is passing, though people living through it couldn't fully recognize that yet. What did Romans think about the future? They believed they built something eternal. Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. The city had existed for 900 years by 165 AD, and surely it would exist for 900 more, 9,000 more. The empire felt permanent, inevitable, ordained by the gods. The idea that it could end seemed impossible. Even when things went badly, the assumption was that Rome would recover, as it always had before. That confidence came from Rome's remarkable resilience. The city had been sacked by Gauls in 390 BC and recovered. The Republic had survived the social war, Sulla's civil war, the wars between Caesar and Pompey, the wars between Octavian and Antony. The empire had survived bad emperors like Caligula and Nero, civil wars and assassinations. Rome endured. That was what Romans believed about themselves. Yet individual Romans lived with constant uncertainty. Plague could strike anyone. Fire could destroy your home. Political winds could shift and leave you ruined. The emperor could take offense at a perceived slight and have you executed or exiled. A bad harvest meant hunger. An accident meant disability or death. A jealous enemy could level accusations against you. The law offered some protection, but mostly to the wealthy and well-connected. For regular Romans, life was precarious, balanced on factors beyond their control. This explains some of the Roman obsession with luck and fortune. Fortuna was a goddess, but also a concept, the random chance that elevated or destroyed you regardless of merit. Romans made offerings to Fortuna, hoping she'd smile on them. They understood that fate could be cruel and arbitrary. Bad things happened to good people constantly. The universe was not just, and the gods were not particularly interested in rewarding virtue. The best you could do was perform the proper rituals, try to live well, and hope. Philosophy offered some comfort to those who studied it. Stoicism, which Marcus Aurelius practiced and wrote about, taught that you should accept what you can't control and focus on maintaining virtue regardless of circumstances. External events don't determine your happiness. Your response to them does. This was tremendously appealing in a world where so much was beyond your power. You couldn't prevent plague or fire or war, but you could maintain your dignity and moral character through them. Epicureanism taught a different path, that pleasure, properly understood, was the highest good. Not hedonistic excess, but the absence of pain and anxiety, achieved through simple living, friendship, and withdrawing from the stresses of public life. Epicurus's famous phrase was "live unknown, stay out of politics and social competition, cultivate your garden literally and metaphorically." This was less popular among Roman elites who were invested in status and power, but had appeal for those who could afford to retire from public life. Most Romans, though, weren't philosophers. They got through life with more pragmatic approaches. They relied on family and community networks. They participated in religious rituals that provided structure and meaning. They enjoyed what pleasures they could afford: food, wine, sex, entertainment. They worked, raised children, gossiped with neighbors, watched the games. They lived, in other words, much like people in any era, making the best of their circumstances. The gap between rich and poor in Rome was vast in a way modern developed countries struggle to comprehend. The wealthiest senators had annual incomes that could exceed 1,000,000 sesterces. A legionary soldier earned 900 sesterces per year. An unskilled laborer might earn 2 or 3 sesterces per day when they could find work, call it 600 or 700 sesterces per year, and they had to feed and house themselves on that. The poorest Romans survived on the grain dole and whatever odd jobs they could get, living in constant poverty without any safety net beyond private charity. The wealthy lived in a completely different world. They owned multiple estates, townhouses with dozens of rooms, hundreds of slaves. They collected art, commissioned poetry, sponsored games. They never worried about where their next meal was coming from, or whether they could afford medical care. For them, Rome's problems were abstract: political maneuvering, maintaining status, dealing with the emperor's demands. For the poor, Rome's problems were immediate: finding enough to eat, avoiding disease, keeping a roof overhead. Yet rich and poor mixed in public spaces in ways they don't in modern stratified societies. At the games, at the baths, in the forum, all classes came together. A senator might find himself standing next to a freed slave or a street vendor. This created a shared urban culture, common experiences and reference points. Everyone knew about the latest chariot race results, the rumors about the emperor, which gladiator had won at yesterday's games. This social mixing didn't mean equality, but it meant Roman identity transcended class in certain contexts. Gender was another fundamental divide. Women were not citizens in the full sense. They couldn't vote or hold office. They were legally under the authority of their father or husband. Yet Roman women, at least elite ones, exercised significant informal power. They managed households, which meant managing staffs of dozens or hundreds of slaves and making economic decisions about significant resources. They influenced their husbands and sons. They hosted salons where politics and culture were discussed. Some, like Livia, Augustus's wife, or Agrippina, Nero's mother, effectively shaped imperial policy. Lower-class women had less dramatic power, but more practical freedom. They worked, ran shops, participated in religious cults, and generally moved through the city with less restriction than their wealthy counterparts who had to maintain respectability. A poor woman selling fish at market didn't have to worry much about her reputation because she didn't have much reputation to lose. She needed to eat, so she worked, and society accepted this necessity even if it wasn't considered ideal. Women in the provinces varied enormously in status and freedom depending on local customs that Rome had absorbed or tolerated. In Egypt, women could own property and conduct business more freely than in Rome itself. In parts of the East, women of wealthy families lived in seclusion. Roman law applied throughout the empire, but in practice, local customs persisted, creating patchwork systems where women's lives could be very different depending on where they lived. Slavery, that persistent horror underlying everything, looked different in different contexts too. Urban domestic slavery in Rome was different from agricultural slavery in Sicily, was different from mining slavery in Spain, was different from the situation of educated Greek slaves who tutored children or managed accounts. A slave could be anything from a valued household member to a disposable laborer worked to death. This variety makes generalizations difficult, but doesn't change the fundamental injustice. These were people owned as property, with no legal rights, subject to their master's absolute authority. The path to freedom for slaves varied. Some masters granted manumission as a reward for long service or in their wills. Some slaves saved money over years or decades and purchased their freedom. Some were freed because their particular skills were valuable enough that operating as a freedman or freedwoman Paying a percentage of earnings to the former master made more economic sense than keeping them enslaved. The Roman system of patronage meant freed slaves remained bound to their former masters through obligation and loyalty, providing services and support in exchange for protection and assistance. Freed slaves faced social stigma, but legal citizenship. Their children were full citizens with no legal disabilities. This meant Roman society had significant social mobility through manumission, though from a terrible starting point. A man could be born a slave, earn freedom, become wealthy through business, and have children who participated fully in Roman society. This happened often enough that elite Romans complained about it, snobs uncomfortable with the idea that freed slaves and their descendants could become powerful and influential. All of this, the slavery, the inequality, the casual cruelty, the technological limitations, the disease and death was just normal life to Romans. They didn't see their society as particularly brutal. It was simply how the world worked. They would have found our society equally strange and troubling in different ways. Our rejection of slavery would puzzle them. Our gender equality would seem bizarre. Our medicine would look like magic. Our technology would be incomprehensible. That's the thing about history. People in the past weren't stupid or primitive. They were dealing with the world as they found it, using the knowledge and resources available to them. They loved their children, mourned their dead, celebrated victories, and endured hardships. They told jokes, fell in love, had dreams and disappointments. They were fully human, living human lives, even though the context was radically different from ours. When you walk through Rome today as a tourist, what you're seeing are the remains of this vast, complex civilization. The Colosseum is just a ruin, but it once roared with 100,000 voices. The Forum is just tumbled stones and broken columns, but it was the center of the world for millions of people. Those aqueducts still marching across the countryside carried the water that kept 1 million people alive. Every piece of ancient Rome has stories, most of them lost, some preserved in fragments that give us glimpses of what it was really like. The archaeological record preserves some remarkably intimate details. We have graffiti from Pompeii, frozen in time by Vesuvius's eruption in 79 AD. Lucius painted this. Someone scrawled on a wall, signing their work like a modern tagger. "I don't want to sell my husband," a woman wrote, probably joking, maybe not. Marcus loves Spendicer appears dozens of times around the city, some desperate lover carving his feelings for everyone to see. There are drawings of gladiators, obscene images, advertisements for prostitutes with prices listed, election slogans supporting local politicians. These weren't meant to survive 2,000 years. They were casual marks made by ordinary people, and they're more immediate and human than any formal history. We have letters preserved on wooden tablets found in waterlogged ruins. A soldier writing home asking his family to send him more socks and underwear. A mother writing to her son, telling him to behave himself. Business correspondence about shipments of goods, deals made and broken, money owed, birthday party invitations. These are the kinds of documents nobody thought to preserve deliberately, but they survived by accident, and they show us people just living their lives, dealing with mundane concerns that wouldn't seem out of place today. We have skeletons that tell stories through bones, the malnutrition, the diseases, the injuries. We can see arthritis in the joints of laborers who did heavy work for decades. We can see evidence of broken bones that healed, sometimes well, sometimes badly. We can see dental abscesses and missing teeth. We can even analyze isotopes in teeth to figure out where people grew up. And sometimes we find that Rome was more cosmopolitan than we'd imagined, with people from across the empire ending up buried in the city. The more we study Roman material culture, the more complex the picture becomes. They weren't just the military empire of our imagination, though they were certainly that. They were also farmers and craftspeople, parents and children, merchants and artists, believers and skeptics. They built beautiful things and terrible things. They created systems that endured and systems that collapsed. They were, in short, people. With all the contradictions that it implies, if you could somehow travel back and spend a day in Rome in 165 AD, you'd be overwhelmed by the sensory assault. The noise would be constant and deafening. The smells would range from the pleasant fresh bread baking, incense at temples, to the overwhelming open sewers, unwashed bodies, smoke from countless fires. The visual spectacle would be stunning. Brightly painted buildings, crowds in colorful clothing, monuments and statues everywhere. But underneath the grandeur, you'd see the poverty, the casual cruelty, the suffering that was just background noise to people living in the moment. You'd probably get sick within days. Your immune system wouldn't be prepared for the diseases circulating in a city with no modern sanitation. You'd struggle with the food, the water, the complete absence of everything you take for granted. You'd be struck by how young everyone looks, because people aged faster, and by how small they are, because nutrition was poor, and childhood diseases stunted growth. You'd be disturbed by the slavery, by the treatment of women, by the public executions and animal cruelty. But you'd also see things that might surprise you: the sophistication of the architecture and engineering, the complexity of the legal system, the literacy and literature, the art and culture, the efficiency of the administration that kept this vast empire functioning, the genuine affection in family relationships that survive in letters and epitaphs, the humor in graffiti and satire, the very human concerns about money, status, health and happiness that transcend 2 millennia. Rome in its imperial height was simultaneously the pinnacle of ancient civilization and a deeply flawed society built on exploitation and violence. It created beauty and horror in equal measure. It preserved knowledge and destroyed cultures. It built monuments that still stand and committed atrocities largely forgotten. Understanding it means holding all these contradictions in mind at once, seeing both what it accomplished and what it cost. The Roman family structure was more complex than the nuclear family model we're used to. Wealthy families lived in extended household compounds with multiple generations under one roof, along with dozens or hundreds of slaves. The paterfamilias, the oldest male in the direct line, had legal authority over everyone: his wife, his children, his grandchildren, even his adult sons and their families if he was still alive. In theory, he could execute his own children if they displeased him. In practice, this rarely happened by the imperial period, but the power structure remained. You didn't truly become your own person until your father died. This created interesting tensions. A man might be 40 years old, a successful businessman or politician, but still technically under his father's authority if the old man was alive. Inheritance usually only came when the paterfamilias died, which could mean waiting decades to come into property and wealth. Some fathers were generous and helped their sons establish themselves. Others held on to control until death. Either way, the multi-generational power dynamic shaped family relationships in ways modern people would find suffocating. Women passed from their father's authority to their husbands, in theory, but by the imperial period there were different types of marriage, and some gave women more independence. In Manus marriage, the wife came fully under her husband's legal authority. In free marriage, which was becoming more common, the wife remained under her father's legal authority, which paradoxically gave her more freedom because her father wasn't living in the same house and managing her daily life. If her father died, she might achieve legal independence that few women otherwise enjoyed. Children were raised with strict discipline. The ideal was to create dutiful, obedient, respectful offspring who honored their parents and the family name. Physical punishment was normal. Children were expected to be seen and not heard in formal contexts. But family correspondence that survives shows genuine affection too. Parents mourned dead children with devastating grief. They celebrated children's accomplishments. They worried about their health and futures. The emotional bonds were real, even within the rigid social structure. Adoption was common among the elite for practical reasons. If you had no biological sons, you adopted an heir, often an adult who could carry on the family name and inherit property. Many emperors came to power through adoption. Augustus adopted Tiberius. Claudius adopted Nero. Trajan adopted Hadrian. Marcus Aurelius adopted Lucius Verus. This wasn't like modern adoption of orphaned children. This was strategic family planning, choosing your successor and making it legal and binding. Naming conventions were formulaic. A male Roman citizen had 3 names: praenomen, personal name, nomen, clan name, and cognomen, family name. So Marcus Tullius Cicero was Marcus of the Tullius clan, from the Cicero family within that clan. Women typically had only two names, a feminine form of their father's nomen, and sometimes a cognomen. If your father was Julius, you were Julia. If he had multiple daughters, you were Julia Major, Julia Minor, Julia Tertia, First Julia, Second Julia, Third Julia. Imagine being Julia the Third your entire life because your father wasn't creative with names. Nicknames and additional cognomens accumulated based on achievements or characteristics. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, earned Magnus through military victories. Publius Cornelius Scipio, Africanus got Africanus for defeating Carthage in Africa. Some cognomens were less flattering. Caligula means little boots, a childhood nickname from his time with the legions that he apparently hated. Nobody was brave enough to stop calling him that to his face once he became emperor, probably because he was terrifyingly unstable. The Roman calendar was a mess until Julius Caesar reformed it. Before that, the calendar was so misaligned with the seasons that priests had to periodically insert extra months to sync things back up, which they sometimes forgot to do or deliberately manipulated for political reasons. Caesar's reforms created the Julian calendar, the basis for our modern calendar, though it was still slightly off, which is why we eventually needed the Gregorian calendar adjustment in 1582. Romans would be amused to know we're still using their calendar structure 2 millennia later. Festivals dotted the Roman calendar, giving structure to the year and providing entertainment and meaning. Saturnalia in December was the big one, a week-long festival where social norms inverted. Slaves were served by their masters. Gambling was openly permitted. People exchanged gifts. Everyone wore the pilios, the felt cap of freed slaves. It was Rome's Christmas, basically, and just as commercial and excessive. The wealthy threw elaborate banquets and gave expensive gifts. The poor got drunk and enjoyed the one time of year when they could speak freely without fear of punishment. Other festivals celebrated different gods or marked agricultural milestones. Lupercalia in February involved priests running through the streets striking women with leather thongs, which was supposed to promote fertility. Yes, really. Vestalia in June honored Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and her temple was open to women bringing offerings. The Floralia in April was raucous and sexually explicit, celebrating spring and flowers with theatre performances that became increasingly obscene as the festival went on. Romans knew how to party, though what constituted entertainment would sometimes shock modern sensibilities. Religious roles for women centered around certain cults. The Vestal Virgins were prestigious and unusual. 6 women, chosen as children, served the goddess Vesta for 30 years, maintaining the sacred fire that could never be allowed to go out. They lived in their own compound near the Forum, had special privileges including prime seating at events, and were among the very few women in Rome with legal independence. They could own property, make wills, and weren't under male authority. The catch? They had to remain virgins for their entire 30-year service. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, she was buried alive. If the sacred fire went out, it was seen as an omen of disaster. The pressure on these women must have been extraordinary. Women also participated in mystery cults, religious movements that promised secret knowledge and spiritual fulfillment. The cult of Isis from Egypt was particularly popular with Roman women. The cult of Bacchus, the god of wine, was so wild that the Senate tried to suppress it in 186 BC, fearing the ecstatic rites and secret ceremonies were undermining social order. The mystery cults offered something the traditional Roman religion didn't: personal spiritual experience and the promise of an afterlife better than the shadowy existence in the underworld that traditional belief offered. The Roman conception of the afterlife was vague and not particularly comforting. The dead went to the underworld, ruled by Pluto and Proserpina, where they existed as shades, shadows of their former selves, wandering in darkness without real consciousness or joy. A few heroes might make it to the Elysian fields, a paradise for the worthy. The truly wicked might suffer in Tartarus. But for most people, death meant becoming a pale ghost in an endless grey twilight. This is why proper burial rites mattered so much. Without them, you might not even make it to the underworld. instead wandering the earth as a restless spirit. Various philosophical and religious movements offered different takes on death. Stoics believed the soul returned to the divine fire from which it came. Epicureans believed death was simply the end, nothing to fear because you wouldn't exist to experience it. Christians, a small persecuted sect during our time period, promised resurrection and eternal life for believers. Each offered its own comfort, its own way of making mortality bearable. The Antonine Plague sweeping through the empire in 165 AD made everyone think about death more than usual. This disease, probably smallpox or measles, killed indiscriminately. Rich and poor, young and old, healthy and sick. It spread along trade routes and military movements, following the very infrastructure that made Rome great. Cities were hit hardest because of the crowding. Rome itself suffered waves of infection, with thousands dying daily during the worst outbreaks. Bodies piled up faster than they could be burned or buried. The smell must have been apocalyptic. People had no idea what caused plague or how it spread. Some blamed bad air, miasma rising from swamps. Some blamed divine punishment for impiety or moral failing. Some blamed poisoners or foreigners. The physician Galen, one of the most influential medical minds in Roman history, wrote about the plague but couldn't explain it in any way that would lead to effective treatment. He recommended avoiding crowds and bad air, which accidentally worked as quarantine advice. But he also prescribed bloodletting and useless herbal remedies. Galen himself fled Rome when the plague was at its worst, returning only when he felt it was safe. Even the best medical knowledge of the age was nearly useless against epidemic disease. The plague killed Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor Lucius Verus in 169 AD. Probably. Historical sources aren't entirely clear, but plague seems likely. It killed Galen's patients despite his treatments. It killed soldiers by the thousands, weakening the legions trying to defend the northern frontier. It killed enough people that it disrupted the economy, left fields unharvested, made skilled labor scarce. Some historians argue the Antonine Plague was the beginning of Rome's decline, the first major shock the system couldn't fully absorb and recover from. But life continued because life always continues. People adapted, as humans do. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and went on living. New children were born to replace those who died, though not in sufficient numbers to fully make up the population loss. Trade continued, though disrupted. The army recruited new soldiers, though they were harder to find and train. The empire persisted, though strained. This resilience in the face of catastrophe is one of the most striking things about studying ancient Rome. They faced disasters that would destroy modern governments: plague, war, political instability, economic crisis, and just kept going. Part of this was necessity. There was no higher authority to appeal to, no international aid, no emergency response infrastructure. You dealt with problems locally, practically, with whatever resources you had. Communities pulled together or collapsed together. The military culture helped. Romans had experience with hardship, discipline, and continuing to function when things were terrible. Soldiers were expected to march all day, build a fortified camp, eat simple rations, sleep on the ground, and be ready to fight the next day. You don't develop that capability overnight. It requires training, discipline, and shared culture that values toughness and persistence. That mentality permeated Roman society more broadly. You endured. Complaining was acceptable. Giving up wasn't. Let's talk about Roman innovation and technology in more depth, because this is where the complexity of their civilization really shows. They invented concrete, as mentioned, which was revolutionary, but they never developed the scientific method to systematically improve it. They used trial and error, passed down successful techniques through practice and apprenticeship. This meant they created amazing things like the Pantheon's dome, but couldn't explain why it worked or reliably reproduce it in different contexts. They built sophisticated water distribution systems but never invented the steam engine, though they had all the necessary components. Hero of Alexandria created a simple steam-powered device called an aeolipile in the 1st century AD, but it was treated as a novelty, a toy for entertainment, not a potential power source. Why? Partly because slave labor was cheap and abundant. Why develop labor-saving devices when you can just use more slaves? This is how slavery retarded technological development, removing the incentive to innovate. They had advanced mathematics for engineering and commerce, but never developed calculus or advanced algebra. They used Roman numerals, which are terrible for complex calculations. Try doing multiplication with Roman numerals and you'll understand why Roman mathematics remained practical and limited. The positional number system we use, inherited from India via the Islamic world, is so superior that it's hard to imagine working without it. Romans managed anyway, using counting boards and abasi for calculations. Medical knowledge was surprisingly advanced in some areas and completely wrong in others. Roman surgeons could perform cataract removal, trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, and various other surgeries with some success. They had over 200 specialized surgical instruments, many of which look remarkably similar to modern equivalents. They understood that wounds should be kept clean, though they didn't understand germ theory. They used opium and henbane for pain relief, which actually worked. But they also believed in humorism, that health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids. They thought different personalities came from having too much blood, phlegm, black bile, or yellow bile. Treatment meant adjusting these humors through diet, bloodletting, purging, or other interventions that were often harmful. They believed women's health problems often stemmed from a wandering uterus that could move around the body, causing symptoms. Yes, that's where hysteria comes from, the Greek word for uterus. The best medical minds of Rome believed and taught this nonsense alongside genuinely useful knowledge. Architecture and engineering were where Rome truly excelled. The arch, the vault, and the dome allowed them to build structures of unprecedented scale. The span of their bridges, the height of their aqueducts, the size of their buildings, all were pushing the limits of what was physically possible with their materials and knowledge. When Rome fell, much of this engineering knowledge was lost, and it took centuries for medieval Europe to relearn how to build at similar scales. But Roman buildings weren't just impressive, they were propaganda. Every emperor wanted to build bigger, better, more spectacular structures than his predecessors. The buildings were statements of power, wealth, and glory. They proclaimed Roman superiority to anyone who saw them. A provincial coming to Rome for the first time would be overwhelmed by the scale and grandeur, concrete demonstration that Rome was the center of the world, and resistance was futile. This propaganda extended to statues, inscriptions, and monuments everywhere. The emperor's image was distributed throughout the empire on coins, statues, and paintings. Inscriptions praised imperial accomplishments, often exaggerating or inventing successes. Triumphal arches celebrated military victories. The Arch of Titus, completed shortly after our time period, depicted the spoils from the destroyed Jewish temple being carried through Rome. It was both commemoration and warning. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. Written propaganda was equally important. Historians like Livy wrote massive works glorifying Rome's past, creating founding myths and celebrating Roman virtues. Poets like Virgil wrote the Aeneid to give Rome a heroic origin, connecting them to Troy and making their empire seem destined by the gods. These weren't neutral historical accounts. They were carefully constructed narratives designed to make Romans feel proud of their civilization and make subject peoples accept Roman rule as natural and inevitable. The flip side of propaganda was censorship and punishment for dissent. Speaking against the emperor could be treason. Writing satirical poetry that mocked imperial family members could get you exiled or executed. Informers, delatores could denounce anyone for maestas, treason against the emperor's majesty, and profit from the confiscated property. This created an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship, especially under particularly paranoid emperors like Tiberius or Domitian. Marcus Aurelius was better than most emperors, more interested in philosophy than persecution. But even he couldn't tolerate Christianity, because Christians refused to participate in imperial cult worship, making them seem like traitors. Christians were occasionally executed in public spectacles, though the scale of persecution varied by time and place. The idea of Christians being constantly thrown to lions is exaggerated, but it did happen sometimes, and the threat was real enough to make Christianity a dangerous faith to practice openly. Different religions and philosophies competed for adherence in this environment. You might worship the traditional Roman gods publicly while privately following a mystery cult. You might be philosophically Stoic while practically Epicurean. Romans compartmentalized these different aspects of spiritual life in ways that seem contradictory to modern minds expecting consistency. But for Romans, participating in state religion was civic duty, and your personal beliefs were your own business as long as you fulfilled your public obligations. The Roman attitude toward sexuality was similarly compartmentalized. There were strict rules about citizen women's sexual behavior. An adulteress could be killed by her husband or father, at least in theory. Female virginity before marriage and fidelity after marriage were essential for ensuring legitimate heirs. But male citizens had tremendous sexual freedom with slaves, prostitutes, and non-citizens. Brothels were legal and regulated. Prostitutes paid taxes. Wealthy men kept concubines. Sexual access was about power and status more than modern concepts of orientation or identity. Same-sex relationships between men were acknowledged but judged based on who was penetrating whom. The active partner was fine. He was demonstrating dominance. The passive partner, if he was a free citizen, was seen as degrading himself by taking a submarital position. Relationships between older men and younger males were documented but complex, surrounded by rules and expectations that varied by social context. The whole system was about hierarchy and power, not about love or equality. Women's same-sex relationships are barely documented in Roman sources, not because they didn't exist, but because men writing histories and literature didn't care much about women's private lives. When they are mentioned, it's usually dismissively or mockingly. The lack of documentation makes it hard to know what women's actual experiences were. A common problem in studying women's history in male-dominated societies that didn't value recording women's perspectives. Prostitution existed at every level. Expensive courtesans who entertained wealthy clients with conversation, music, and sex. Mid-range prostitutes working in brothels. Cheap street prostitutes servicing customers in alleys for a few coins. Most prostitutes were slaves or desperately poor free women. It was legal but socially shameful. A free woman who worked as a prostitute lost her legal rights and social standing. She couldn't later claim to be respectable or marry into decent society. It was one-way transition into the bottom tier of social hierarchy. Male prostitutes served male clients and faced similar social stigma, though the dynamics were different. Some were slaves forced into it. Some were free men desperate enough to accept the shame for the money. Brothels that catered to male clients existed, though less openly than those serving men seeking women. The whole sex industry was visible but not spoken about in polite company. A parallel world existing alongside respectable society. The Roman military, which we've touched on but deserves deeper examination, was the most professional, well-organized fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. Legion structure was standardized across the empire. Every legion had roughly 5,000 heavy infantry organized into 10 cohorts, each cohort divided into 6 centuries, each century commanded by a centurion. The organization was sophisticated, with clear chain of command, standardized training, uniform equipment, and established procedures for everything from setting up camp to conducting sieges. A legionary's equipment was expensive and standardized. The lorica segmentata, the iconic segmented armor you see in movies, probably wasn't as universal as popular culture suggests, but it existed. Chainmail and scale armor were common too. The scutum, the curved rectangular shield, was designed to interlock with those of the men beside you, creating a shield wall. The gladius, the short stabbing sword, was optimized for close quarters combat in formation. The pilum, the throwing spear, was designed to bend on impact so enemies couldn't throw it back. Every piece of equipment had a purpose, refined through centuries of warfare. Training was brutal and constant. New recruits underwent months of intensive conditioning, marching with heavy packs, weapons training with wooden swords against posts, formation drills until the movements were automatic. Experienced soldiers continued training throughout their service. A legion could go from marching column to battle formation in minutes because they'd practiced the maneuvers hundreds of times. This discipline and training meant that Roman armies usually defeated larger forces of less organized enemies. Tactics varied by enemy and terrain, But the basic principles remained consistent: maintain formation, use combined arms with infantry, cavalry, and auxiliary troops, exploit enemy weaknesses, and never panic. Roman generals studied military history and tactics. Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars were partly propaganda, but also detailed tactical analysis, useful for training future commanders. Military literature was its own genre, preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. The auxiliaries, non-citizen troops who served alongside the legions, provided specialized capabilities. Cretan archers, Balearic slingers, Numidian cavalry, Germanic warriors. Rome incorporated troops from across the empire, using their specialized skills. Auxiliaries served for 25 years and received Roman citizenship upon discharge, a powerful incentive. Their children would be citizens, able to join the legions. This was how Rome integrated conquered peoples, turning them from enemies to stakeholders in the empire's success. Fleets patrolled against pirates, protected grain shipments, and projected power along coasts. Roman warships, particularly the trireme and quinquereme, with multiple banks of oars, could ram enemy ships or grapple them for boarding. Marines would storm across Corvus bridges, turning naval battles into infantry fights, where Roman training gave them advantages. After destroying Carthage's navy in the Punic Wars, Rome faced no serious naval challenges for centuries. But maintaining all this military power was exhausting. Legions had to be paid, equipped, and kept stationed at frontiers far from Rome. The cost was enormous. The logistical challenge of supplying troops in Britain or Syria was staggering. Food, equipment, replacement troops, all had to flow constantly from the interior to the borders. When this system functioned smoothly, it was impressive. When it broke down, disasters followed. The soldiers themselves were diverse. Most legionaries were citizens from Italy or heavily Romanized provinces. They came from rural areas, younger sons with no inheritance, seeking steady pay and land upon retirement. Some came from military families, joining because it was the family tradition. They spent their 20 to 25-year careers stationed far from home, often never returning to their birthplace. They married local women, though these marriages weren't legally recognized during service. They had children who grew up in military settlements. They became part of frontier society, neither fully Roman nor fully native, something in between. Veterans who survived their service received land grants, usually in veteran colonies near where they'd served. These colonies became seeds of Romanization, spreading Latin language, Roman law, and Roman culture into frontier regions. A veteran settlement in Gaul or Pannonia would become a center of Roman influence, gradually transforming the surrounding area. This was deliberate policy, turning soldiers into colonists, securing borders through settlement rather than just military force. The Praetorian Guard, stationed in Rome itself, was different from regular legions, better paid, serving shorter terms. They were the emperor's personal force and had enormous political power. They'd assassinated emperors and installed new ones. They auctioned off the empire to Didius Julianus, as mentioned earlier. Being in the Guard was cushy compared to frontier service, but politically dangerous. You were close to power, which meant close to palace intrigue and its lethal consequences. Rome's roads, those famous straight highways, served military purposes first, economic purposes second. Legions could march quickly on paved roads, moving from one trouble spot to another before enemies could exploit weakness. The cursus publicus, the state courier system, carried messages at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph. A message could travel from Rome to the northern frontier in about 10 days using relay stations with fresh horses. For the ancient world, this was blazing fast. Information and orders could flow, keeping the vast empire coordinated. The roads also facilitated trade, which made them economically valuable. Merchants used them to transport goods. Travelers used them for pilgrimages or tourism. Yes, Romans traveled for pleasure, if they could afford it. Wealthy Romans visited Greece to see classical sites, traveled to Egypt to see the pyramids, which were already ancient tourist attractions. They wrote graffiti on monuments just like modern tourists, carving their names to prove they'd been there. Some things never change. The cultural exchange along these roads spread Roman culture outward. and brought foreign influences inward. Greek philosophy and art heavily influenced Rome. Eastern religions like the cults of Isis and Mithras traveled west. Trade goods like silk from China and spices from India reached Rome. The empire was multicultural and cosmopolitan in ways that might surprise those who imagine it as purely European. Rome itself was probably the most diverse city in the world, with people from every corner of the empire living, working, and mixing together. This diversity created tension alongside opportunity. Romans considered themselves culturally superior, seeing their way of life as civilized and others as barbarous. This wasn't racial in the modern sense. Romans didn't have our concept of race. It was cultural. Anyone could become Roman by adopting Roman language, law, and customs. But the assumption of superiority was real and pervasive. Provincial peoples were expected to adopt Roman ways and be grateful for it. Some embraced it enthusiastically, others resented the imposition while pragmatically participating. The relationship between Rome and its provinces varied across time and space. Some provinces were peaceful and prosperous, fully integrated into the empire. Others simmered with resentment and periodically rebelled. Some regions contributed more in taxes than they cost to maintain. Others, particularly frontier provinces requiring heavy military presence, were net drains on resources but strategically necessary. The calculus of empire was complex, constantly shifting, requiring careful balancing of costs and benefits. Currency standardization helped hold the economic system together. Roman coins were accepted throughout the empire and even beyond its borders. Merchants in India and Africa knew Roman coinage and accepted it. This created a unified market of unprecedented scale. Goods flowed freely, prices were comparable across regions, and economic integration made the empire function as a single economic unit despite vast distances and diverse populations. But the money supply depended on precious metals, primarily gold and silver, which were finite resources. As the empire matured and expansion slowed, new sources of gold and silver became scarcer. Emperors debased the coinage, reducing the precious metal content to make more coins from the same amount of metal. This caused inflation, as people realized the coins were worth less and demanded more of them for goods. The economic problems this created would worsen over the coming centuries, contributing to the empire's eventual decline. Climate played a role that historians are only recently fully appreciating. The Roman climate optimum, a period of warm, stable weather from about 200 BC to 150 AD, made agriculture more productive and supported larger populations. But around the time of the Antonine Plague, the climate was beginning to shift. Cooler temperatures, more variable weather, and possibly drought in some regions made farming harder and harvests less reliable. Climate change, natural climate change, not human-caused, was altering the environmental conditions that had supported Rome's expansion and prosperity. All of these factors, plague, climate change, economic strain, military pressure on frontiers, political instability, were beginning to converge by the late 2nd century. Rome was still powerful, still impressive, still the greatest empire the world had seen. But the Golden Age was passing. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, trying to hold everything together through force of will and Stoic philosophy, was fighting wars that could be won but not permanently solved. The Germanic tribes defeated this year would be replaced by new groups next year. The Parthian Empire in the east remained a constant threat. The system was becoming unsustainable, yet Romans didn't see it that way. They believed in Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. The idea that their civilization could end was unthinkable. They'd overcome every previous crisis. They'd adapt to this one too. And they did, for a while. The empire would persist for another 3 centuries in the west, morphing and adapting, becoming something different from what it had been. In the east, as the Byzantine Empire, it would last until 1453, over 1,000 years beyond Marcus Aurelius. What would eventually destroy Western Rome wasn't a single cause but an accumulation of pressures: economic problems, military challenges, political instability, environmental changes, disease, and the gradual transformation of the empire into something that couldn't maintain the centralized control and cultural unity that had defined it. The barbarians who eventually sacked Rome were often integrated into the Roman system, serving as auxiliaries or foederati, allied troops. They didn't destroy Rome from outside, so much as the distinction between Roman and barbarian gradually blurred until it ceased to be meaningful. But all of that is still centuries in the future from our moment in 165 AD. In this moment, Rome is still mighty, still confident, still the center of the world. The average Roman living in the city or in a provincial town doesn't think about long-term historical trends. They think about their immediate concerns: feeding their family, paying their rent, avoiding disease, finding work, participating in religious festivals, watching the games, gossiping about their neighbors, trying to be happy despite the hardships. And there were moments of happiness, genuine joy, even in this difficult world: the laughter at a theatrical comedy, the excitement of a close chariot race, the satisfaction of a good meal with friends, the comfort of family gathering for a religious festival, the pride in a child's accomplishment, the simple pleasure of a cool bath on a hot day. Romans were people, fully human, capable of the same range of emotions we experience. Their circumstances were different, often harsher, but their fundamental humanity was identical to ours. When you strip away the exotic historical details and focus on the human experiences, Romans loved and grieved, hoped and feared, struggled and endured, just like people in any era. A mother mourning a dead child felt the same pain whether it was in 165 AD or today. A soldier far from home felt the same loneliness. A young couple falling in love felt the same excitement. The specifics of their lives, the togas and aqueducts and gladiators, matter for understanding their world, but the emotional reality transcends time. This is why studying history matters, not just to learn about past events, but to understand that humans have always been human. We're not fundamentally different from our ancestors, smarter or more moral or more advanced in our thinking. We have better tools, more knowledge, more comfortable lives in many ways. But our basic nature, our capacity for both kindness and cruelty, our ability to endure hardship and find joy in small things, our tendency to love our families and fear death and hope for better futures, all of that is timeless. The Romans created beautiful art and committed terrible atrocities. They built lasting monuments and destroyed entire cultures. They preserved ancient knowledge and burned libraries. They were capable of great compassion and horrific cruelty, sometimes the same individuals capable of both. This complexity is what makes them interesting and worth understanding. They weren't villains or heroes. They were people, navigating their world with the knowledge and values they inherited, sometimes rising above those limitations, often falling short. Modern life owes an enormous debt to Rome, for better and worse. Our legal systems trace back to Roman law. Our languages, if you speak a Romance language, descend from Latin. Our architecture mimics Roman styles. Our political concepts, republic, senate, citizen, come from Rome. Even our calendar is Roman. We're still living in the shadow of Rome 2,000 years later, still grappling with questions about empire, power, citizenship, and civilization that they faced first. And when you walk through Rome today, when you touch stones laid 2,000 years ago, when you stand in the Colosseum or the Forum, or look at the aqueducts marching across the countryside, you're connecting directly to those people. The stones they cut, the structures they built, have outlasted them by millennia. The graffiti scrawled on Pompeii's walls speaks more immediately than any formal history. Someone carved that, hoping to immortalize his feelings, and succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. His love survived when empires didn't. That's what history gives us. Connection across time. The knowledge that we're part of something larger than our individual lives. A human story stretching backward into the past and forward into the future. The Romans are gone, but their story remains, preserved in ruins and documents and artifacts waiting for us to discover it, understand it, and see ourselves reflected in it. So that's what life was really like in ancient Rome. Not the clean marble statues and noble senators of Hollywood. Not the simple narrative of inevitable decline and fall. The real, messy, complicated, fascinating, brutal, beautiful reality of a million people living in the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. part of an empire spanning 3 continents, at a moment when everything seemed eternal but change was already beginning. You've traveled back 2,000 years tonight, walked the streets of Rome, lived as a Roman lived, seen what they saw, felt what they felt. You've experienced the noise and the smell, the grandeur and the squalor, the spectacle and the suffering. You've met emperors and slaves, soldiers and merchants, families trying to survive and philosophers trying to understand. You've witnessed a civilization at its height, confident and powerful, unaware that its greatest challenges were still ahead. And now you're back in your comfortable bed, in a world with antibiotics and air conditioning, running water and electric lights, where infant mortality is rare and life expectancy is twice what Romans experienced, where slavery is illegal and women can vote and you can speak freely without fear of execution. The distance between their world and yours is staggering. Every comfort you take for granted, your mattress, your pillow, your ability to read this on a screen, your expectation of living past 40 would seem like impossible luxury to most Romans. But you're also connected to them. The same sun that warms you warmed them. The same moon and stars they watched still shine in the sky. The same fundamental human hopes and fears that moved them move you. When you feel grateful for what you have, when you endure hardship with dignity, when you build something meant to last, when you love someone despite knowing death will eventually part you, you're living experiences they would recognize and understand. History isn't just about learning facts and dates. It's about understanding the full range of human experience across time, seeing how people like us lived in circumstances utterly unlike ours, and recognizing both the differences and the similarities. The Romans weren't so different from us that we can't understand them, and they weren't so similar that we can assume their world worked like ours. Holding both of those truths at once is what lets us actually learn from history, rather than just imposing our assumptions on it. Let's dive deeper into some aspects of Roman life we haven't fully explored yet, because there's so much more to understand about what it meant to live in this world. Crime and punishment in Rome reveal a society obsessed with order, but deeply unequal in how justice was applied. If you were wealthy and committed a crime, you might face exile, a fine, or in extreme cases forced suicide, which was considered more dignified than execution. You'd retire to a private room, open your veins in a warm bath, and drift away while friends and family said goodbye. This was considered an honorable death, preserving your dignity and allowing your family to inherit your property. If you were poor and committed the same crime, you might be crucified, thrown to wild animals, burned alive, or sent to the mines. The law explicitly had different penalties for honest aurors, the respectable classes, and humilios, the lower classes. A senator who killed someone might lose his position and be exiled. A poor man who killed someone would be executed in a manner designed to terrify the public and discourage others from similar crimes. Justice wasn't blind. It knew exactly who you were and treated you accordingly. Torture was built into the legal system for extracting confessions and testimony. Slaves, as mentioned, could only testify under torture because their word was considered inherently untrustworthy. The rack, where your limbs were stretched until joints dislocated. The scourge, a whip with multiple leather thongs often embedded with metal or bone. The hot irons applied to flesh. These weren't aberrations. They were standard judicial procedure. Judges believed that pain revealed truth, that someone would lie if they could, but would tell the truth when suffering became unbearable. This assumption was wrong, of course. People under torture say whatever they think their torturers want to hear, but it remained legal practice throughout the empire's existence. Prisons existed, but weren't primarily for punishment. They were holding cells where you waited for trial or execution. The Tullianum in Rome, a dark underground chamber, was where enemies of the state spent their final days before execution. It was intentionally horrible, damp and lightless, meant to break prisoners psychologically before they died. Long-term imprisonment as punishment was rare. If you were guilty, you were executed, exiled, enslaved, or fined. Keeping prisoners fed and guarded long-term was expensive and pointless by Roman thinking. Robbery and theft were common in a city with huge wealth disparities and limited law enforcement. If someone robbed you in daylight on a busy street, You might get help from bystanders or the urban cohorts if they happen to be nearby. If someone robbed you at night in a dark alley, you were probably out of luck. Unless you could identify the thief and bring a private prosecution, nothing would happen. There was no police force investigating crimes on behalf of victims. You were responsible for your own justice, which meant the wealthy could afford to pursue thieves and the poor couldn't. Murder rates in Rome were probably higher than in modern developed countries, though we'll never know exact figures. Historians estimate based on skeletal remains showing trauma, on literary references to murders, on legal cases that survive. People carried weapons and used them. Street fights turned deadly. Slaves killed abusive masters, and the law responded by executing every slave in the household, even if they had nothing to do with it. This rule existed to terrify slaves into protecting their masters from other slaves. The injustice was the point. If your master was murdered, you'd be tortured and executed regardless of your involvement. So you'd better stop any other slave who seemed to be considering violence. Domestic violence was largely invisible and legal. A husband could beat his wife with minimal legal consequences as long as he didn't kill her. A father could beat his children. A master could beat slaves with no consequences at all. The paterfamilias had absolute authority within his household, and what happened inside the home was private business. Only extreme cases, where someone was beaten to death or maimed, might result in social disapproval or legal action. Routine violence was just how households maintained order. Child abuse was similarly invisible. Exposing unwanted infants to die was legal. Selling children into slavery was legal in desperate circumstances. Physical punishment of children was expected and encouraged. The concept of childhood trauma didn't exist. Children were expected to obey absolutely and accept punishment without complaint. A child who talked back or disobeyed might be beaten severely, and this was considered proper parenting, building character and respect for authority. Sexual abuse of children, particularly slaves, happened and was barely acknowledged as wrong. A slave child had no protection. If the master wanted to rape a slave child, that was his property to use as he wished. Free children had more protection, but even there, the abuse of children by adults in positions of authority happened and was rarely prosecuted unless the child came from a powerful family. The vulnerable were unprotected in ways that should disturb anyone with modern moral sensibilities. Animals in Rome lived under similarly brutal conditions. The sheer number of animals killed for entertainment is staggering. The Colosseum's opening games in 80 AD reportedly saw 9,000 animals killed over 100 days. Lions, bears, elephants, rhinoceroses, leopards, crocodiles, ostriches, anything exotic and dangerous was captured across the empire and brought to Rome to be slaughtered in the arena. They'd fight each other, fight gladiators, or simply be executed en masse by archers and spearmen. The crowds loved it. The logistics of this animal slaughter were extraordinary. You needed to capture animals in North Africa, Egypt, or Germania, transport them hundreds or thousands of miles, keeping them alive, house them in facilities near the amphitheaters, feed them, care for them, train them to be aggressive for the arena, then kill them for entertainment. The expense was enormous, but emperors and wealthy politicians spent fortunes because it bought popularity. Citizens might be starving, but give them spectacular beast hunts and they'd cheer your name. Working animals, oxen, donkeys, horses, mules were worked until they collapsed. There were no animal cruelty laws. If your ox went lame, you either sold it for meat or abandoned it. If your horse broke a leg, you killed it. Animals were property, tools that happened to be alive. They received care only to the extent that it maintained their economic value. A valuable racehorse might be treated carefully, but a common pack mule was just a disposable resource. Dogs were kept as guards and hunting companions, and some were treated affectionately as pets, but many were strays roaming the streets, eating garbage, forming packs, sometimes attacking people. Cats were less common than you might expect. They were associated with Egypt and the cult of Isis more than with typical Roman households. Rats and mice were everywhere, and people tried various methods to control them: traps, poisons, keeping snakes or weasels, but with limited success. Insects were an inescapable part of life. No screens on windows, no insecticides, no real understanding of insect-borne diseases. Mosquitoes spread malaria through the marshes around Rome and in many other regions. Fleas and lice were constant companions for most people and carried typhus. Bedbugs infested mattresses and furniture. People would try to kill them with smoke or heat, or by exposing bedding to sun, but they always came back. You just lived with insects biting you, itching constantly, knowing there was no real solution. Food preservation challenges shaped what people ate and how they lived. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled in hours during summer. You'd buy it fresh from the butcher and cook it immediately, or you bought it already preserved through salting or smoking. Fish underwent the same treatment. The famous garum, that fermented fish sauce, was partly a preservation technique. The fermentation killed harmful bacteria while preserving the protein and making it transportable. Grain could be stored if kept dry, but weevils and other pests were constant problems. Ancient granaries have been found with traces of insect damage throughout the stored grain. People ate weevils along with their bread and porridge because there was no practical way to remove them completely. It was extra protein, if you wanted to think about it that way, and most people tried not to think about it at all. Wine and olive oil were critical, partly because they lasted longer than fresh food. Wine could be stored for years in sealed amphoras, olive oil kept for months or longer. Both were portable, tradable, and reliable sources of calories and nutrition. The Mediterranean diet of grain, wine, and olive oil wasn't just cultural preference. It was practical adaptation to what could be preserved and transported with available technology. Milk, as mentioned earlier, spoiled almost immediately in the heat, so Romans didn't drink much of it. They made cheese, which lasted longer and was more portable. Different regions had different cheese-making traditions, and some of these cheeses still exist in modified forms today. The Romans were already making something like Pecorino Romano 2,000 years ago, and the recipe hasn't changed that much. Honey was the only sweetener, and it was expensive. Sugarcane existed but wouldn't become available in Europe until much later. So most Romans never tasted anything as sweet as a modern candy bar or soft drink. Fruit was sweet, honey was sweet, and that was it. The human craving for sweetness existed but couldn't be satisfied the way it can be now, with cheap refined sugar everywhere. The total absence of stimulants we take for granted is striking. No coffee, no tea, no chocolate, no tobacco. Romans had wine for a mild buzz and opium for a stronger one, but nothing like caffeine to wake you up or nicotine for a quick hit. Waking up exhausted from a bad night's sleep in a hot, airless apartment with no coffee to help you function must have been miserable. You just pushed through on willpower, and maybe diluted wine for breakfast. Speaking of sleep, sleep cycles were different before artificial light. Romans practiced biphasic sleep in many cases, sleeping for a few hours, waking in the middle of the night for an hour or two, then sleeping again until dawn. This is how humans naturally sleep when following only circadian rhythms without electric lights keeping us awake. The middle of the night wake period was used for prayer, sex, visiting neighbors, reading, or just lying in the dark thinking. It was considered normal, not insomnia. Dreams were taken very seriously as messages from the gods or omens about the future. If you had a striking dream, you might consult a dream interpreter, a professional who analyzed dreams according to traditional symbolic meanings. Dream interpretation manuals survive from the ancient world, explaining what different dream symbols supposedly predicted. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant death in the family. Dreaming of water meant upcoming emotional turmoil. It was nonsense, but people believed it because they desperately wanted to find meaning and control in a chaotic, dangerous world. Aging in Rome was different from modern aging. People didn't expect to live into old age, so reaching 60 or 70 was genuinely remarkable. Old people were relatively rare, and survivors often had high status simply from having beaten the odds. The Senate was full of old men because only those who'd lived long enough could accumulate the experience and connections needed for high office. But many of these old men were in poor health, suffering from conditions we could now treat easily. Arthritis was common from decades of physical labor or military service. Dental problems affected almost everyone over 30. Cataracts made people blind, though some Roman surgeons could perform couching, pushing the clouded lens aside to partially restore vision. Heart disease and stroke killed many. Cancer existed but was poorly understood, and treatment was ineffective or harmful. Dementia in its various forms affected some elderly Romans, and families cared for them as best they could with no medical interventions available. Elderly people without family were vulnerable. There was no social security, no old age pension for most people. If you hadn't saved money or didn't have children to support you, you might end up begging in the streets or starving. Some old people were taken in by religious communities or charitable organizations, but these were limited. The family was the only real safety net, and if you had no family, your prospects in old age were grim. Women who survived childbearing years and made it to old age often outlived their husbands and gained a measure of freedom as widows. A widow with property had legal control over it and couldn't be forced to remarry. Some widows became quite powerful, managing large estates or businesses, though society expected them to remain respectable and modest. Other widows fell into poverty if their husband's estate was encumbered with debt, or if male relatives took control of property that should have been theirs. The elderly were supposed to be respected for their wisdom and experience, but real treatment varied. Some old people were honored and cared for lovingly. Others were seen as burdens, eating resources while contributing little. Without modern medicine's ability to maintain quality of life in old age, many elderly Romans were in constant pain, partially blind or deaf, struggling with basic tasks, dependent on others for care. It wasn't the golden years, it was survival. Disability in Rome is a topic where sources are frustratingly incomplete. We know disabled people existed, war veterans who'd lost limbs, people born with conditions, those injured in accidents or by disease, but Roman literature rarely discusses them in detail. What we can piece together suggests disabled people who were wealthy could live relatively comfortable lives, supported by family and slaves who helped with tasks they couldn't perform. Poor disabled people begged, and some became quite skilled at making their disabilities visible to attract sympathy and donations. Carter. One, prosthetics existed in rudimentary forms. Artificial legs were basically wooden peg legs, far less sophisticated than modern prosthetics but better than nothing for mobility. Artificial hands were rarely functional, but might be worn for appearance. Eye patches covered missing eyes. Crutches helped those who couldn't walk normally, but many disabled people received no accommodation and simply had to survive as best they could in a society with no accessibility standards. Mental illness and intellectual disabilities are even harder to trace in the sources. Some people described in ancient texts as mad or simple clearly had conditions we'd now diagnose as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, developmental disabilities or brain injuries. Treatment was non-existent or actively harmful. Restraint, isolation, sometimes exorcism if the problem was attributed to demons or divine punishment. Families cared for affected members when possible, but no therapeutic interventions existed. The concept of PTSD didn't exist, but the reality certainly did. Soldiers returning from years of brutal combat, having seen friends die, having killed people in close quarters, often struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Some became violent, some couldn't sleep, some drank heavily. Roman sources mention veterans who were troubled or changed by their experiences, but there was no framework for understanding or treating what we now recognize as combat trauma. Slavery's impact on psychology affected everyone. Masters who could rape and beat and kill human beings they owned were shaped by that power. Slaves who lived under constant threat developed survival strategies, deference, cunning, emotional shutdown that were fundamentally traumatic. The children of slaves learned fear and helplessness from birth. The children of masters learned entitlement and cruelty. The whole system corrupted everyone it touched, creating patterns of violence and dominance that perpetuated across generations. The psychological impact of infant mortality on parents is something worth considering. If you knew that half your children might die before age 5, how did that affect your emotional attachment? Some historians suggest Roman parents were more emotionally distant from young children, protecting themselves from inevitable grief, but epitaphs for dead children are devastatingly sad. suggesting parents loved their children intensely despite the risks. They just had to live with a level of grief that would be considered unusual and tragic in modern developed countries, but was routine in Rome. The stress of daily survival for poor Romans must have been crushing. Never quite enough food, always worried about rent, vulnerable to disease, one accident or illness away from destitution, no safety net, no insurance, no one to appeal to for help beyond immediate community and patron-client relationships. The psychological toll of chronic insecurity is immense, and most Romans lived with it their entire lives. Even the wealthy lived with stresses we don't face. Political life was cutthroat, and falling from favor could mean exile, execution, or financial ruin. Your fortune could be confiscated by an emperor who needed funds or took offense at a perceived slight. Your children could be married off for political alliances regardless of their wishes. Your entire social position depended on maintaining relationships and reputation, which required constant attention and strategic maneuvering. Different stresses than the poor faced, but real nonetheless. The absence of privacy in Roman life created its own pressures. The poor lived in crowded apartments where every sound from neighbors penetrated thin walls. The wealthy lived in houses full of slaves who saw and heard everything. Business was conducted publicly in the forum. Bathing was communal. Even toilets were shared spaces. The modern expectation of private spaces where you can be alone with your thoughts barely existed. You were always observed, always performing your social role, always aware of others' presence. This lack of privacy extended to information. Anything you told anyone might be repeated, exaggerated, distorted. Rumors spread through the city at incredible speed. A scandal in the morning would be known throughout Rome by evening, passed mouth to mouth through markets, baths, and dinner parties. This made reputation fragile. One false accusation, one embarrassing incident, one moment of weakness, and your social standing could be destroyed by gossip you couldn't control or refute effectively. The informality of information transmission meant fake news was rampant. Rumors of military defeats, plots against the emperor, disasters in the provinces, all circulated constantly with no way to verify them until official word arrived days or weeks later. People made decisions based on information that was often completely wrong. Merchants might panic and sell goods based on false reports. Politicians might plot based on rumors that turned out to be baseless. The information environment was even less reliable than our own, which is saying something. Letters were the only way to communicate across distances, and they were slow, unreliable, and not private. A letter from Rome to the eastern provinces might take weeks or months to arrive, and might not arrive at all if the ship carrying it sank or the courier was robbed. Letters could be intercepted and read by officials or anyone else who got hold of them. People wrote in code or used trusted slaves as messengers for sensitive information, but there was always risk. The postal system, the cursus publicus, was reserved for official government business. Private individuals had to arrange their own message delivery, hiring couriers or asking travelers heading in the right direction to carry letters. The speed and reliability of information transfer was a major limiting factor on how the empire functioned. Governors had considerable autonomy because they couldn't consult with Rome on every decision. By the time a message reached Rome and a response came back, months had passed and circumstances had likely changed. Travel itself was slow and dangerous. A fast courier on horseback using the relay stations of the cursus publicus could cover perhaps 50 miles a day. A merchant traveling with goods moved much slower, perhaps 15 or 20 miles daily. Sea travel was faster when conditions were good, but also more dangerous. Ships didn't sail in winter when storms were common. The Mediterranean shipping season ran roughly from April to October, and even then, unexpected storms could sink ships with no warning. Thousands of Roman shipwrecks have been found by underwater archaeologists, each representing a disaster where cargo and often lives were lost. Piracy was a constant threat, despite Roman naval power. The open sea was dangerous, and small pirate vessels could attack merchant ships, killing or enslaving the crew and stealing the cargo. Rome had largely suppressed organized piracy, but small-scale raids continued. Coastal communities were vulnerable to pirate attacks, with people occasionally being kidnapped and sold into slavery. The fear of piracy was real enough that it shaped settlement patterns and trade routes. Bandits on land were similarly problematic. The famous Roman roads were patrolled, but you couldn't patrol everywhere all the time. Travelers moved in groups for safety when possible. Armed guards accompanied valuable shipments, but a solitary traveler on a remote stretch of road was vulnerable, and bandit attacks were common enough that everyone knew someone who'd been robbed or worse. Disease traveled along these same routes. Merchants and soldiers carried illnesses from one region to another, spreading epidemics across the empire. The Antonine Plague probably arrived from the east, brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in Mesopotamia. As it spread along trade routes and military movements, it killed millions. There was no way to quarantine effectively, no understanding of contagion that would lead to useful preventive measures. People just watched it spread and hoped they'd be spared. The interconnection of the empire meant that problems anywhere could become problems everywhere. A bad harvest in Egypt meant food shortages in Rome. A rebellion in Britannia meant soldiers diverted from other fronts. A plague in the east meant economic disruption throughout the empire. The same infrastructure and connections that made Rome powerful also made it vulnerable to cascading failures. Let's talk more about the actual city of Rome in physical detail, because the sheer density and chaos of it are hard to fully convey. 1 million people crammed into a relatively small area created problems that no amount of engineering could fully solve. The noise was relentless. Workshops with hammering and sawing, vendors shouting, animals making noise, construction, arguments, street preachers, beggars calling for alms, children playing. The cacophony never stopped, and there was nowhere to escape it, unless you were wealthy enough to own a villa outside the city. The smell has been mentioned, but it's worth emphasizing. Human waste, animal waste, garbage rotting in the streets, smoke from thousands of fires, the distinctive smell of tanning leather, the reek of fish sauce factories, body odor from people who bathed occasionally but had no deodorant. The olfactory assault was constant. Wealthier homes burned incense constantly, partly for religious reasons but mostly to mask the ambient stench. Perfumes were popular among those who could afford them, and everyone knew the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies was normal. The visual experience was overwhelming. Brightly painted buildings in reds, yellows, blues, and golds. Marble statues everywhere, also originally painted though the paint has long since worn away. Shop signs and advertisements painted on walls. Graffiti in every public space. Garbage in the streets because there was no systematic garbage collection, just crews that would remove it occasionally, while most was left to rot or be eaten by animals. The crowds were intense. Narrow streets packed with people, animals, carts during permitted hours, sedan chairs carrying wealthy individuals, slaves running errands, street performers, prostitutes soliciting, pickpockets working the crowds. Getting from one side of Rome to the other could take hours, fighting through the press of humanity. Being crushed in the crowd was a real danger. Occasionally people would be trampled to death in particularly congested areas, and there was nothing you could do except try to avoid the worst bottlenecks. The Forum Romanum itself was simultaneously the empire's center of power and a chaotic marketplace. Imagine Wall Street, the Supreme Court, and a county fair all occupying the same space. Senators discussed policy, while vendors sold sausages. Important trials proceeded while street performers did tricks for coins. The sacred and the commercial, the powerful and the desperate, all mixed together in a way that would seem bizarrely inappropriate now, but was just normal life in Rome. The different hills of Rome had different characters. The Palatine Hill was where the emperors built their palaces, sprawling complexes that eventually covered much of the hill. The Aventine was more mixed, with both wealthy residents and working-class areas. The Esquiline had been a potter's field, a burial ground for the poor, before Augustus cleaned it up and made it more respectable, but its grim past wasn't fully forgotten. The Capitoline was the sacred heart of Rome, with the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus dominating the summit. The valleys between hills were where most ordinary Romans lived, in those towering insulos we discussed. These buildings were constructed with minimal regulation and maximum profit motive. Ground floors were stone or concrete, relatively solid, Upper floors were increasingly jerry-rigged, added on as afterthoughts, built with wood and mud brick, structurally unsound. Collapses were common enough that they barely merited mention in sources unless someone important died. Dozens of poor people crushed under rubble. Just another day in Rome. Fire regulations existed, but were routinely ignored. People cooked in upper-story apartments despite laws against it, because what else were they supposed to do? They needed to eat. Open flames in wooden buildings packed closely together in a city with no fire hydrants or modern firefighting equipment meant fires were inevitable and often catastrophic. The vigils, the fire brigade, tried their best, forming bucket chains and using pumps to spray water, but once a fire got going in the insula, it often had to just burn itself out. The Tiber River running through Rome was both resource and hazard. It provided water, though the water was increasingly polluted as you moved downstream through the city. It flooded regularly, sometimes catastrophically, inundating low-lying areas and destroying buildings near the banks. The floods brought disease as sewage and other filth spread through flood zones, but the river was also essential for commerce. With the port of Rome several miles upriver from the sea, where goods were offloaded from seagoing ships onto river barges for the final leg to the city. Bridges across the Tiber were architectural achievements and vital infrastructure. The oldest was supposedly built in the 7th century BC, and several had existed for centuries by our time period. They were stone, some quite beautiful, and they carried enormous traffic. Losing a bridge would partially isolate parts of the city, so maintaining them was crucial. Bodies of executed criminals and suicides were sometimes thrown from the bridges into the river, adding to the general grimness. The Vatican area across the river was outside the city proper in 165 AD, mostly gardens and Nero's circus where he'd staged races and executed Christians. St. Peter's Basilica wouldn't be built for another century and a half. The area was considered somewhat peripheral, not really part of Rome proper, though wealthy people had estates there to escape the city's density. Beyond the city were the suburbs, including necropoli, cities of the dead, lining the major roads, tombs of varying grandeur, from simple grave markers to elaborate monuments. Families would visit tombs on festival days, leaving offerings and sharing meals with the dead in a symbolic sense. Death was integrated into life, visible and acknowledged, not hidden away in distant cemeteries you never visited. The countryside around Rome, the Ager Romanus, was dotted with villages, farms and estates. Large agricultural estates, latifundia, worked by slave labor produced grain, wine, olive oil, and other products for market. Smaller family farms struggled to compete economically. Many small farmers had lost their land over the centuries, forced to sell to larger owners, and either move to the city or become tenant farmers. This concentration of agricultural land in fewer hands was a long-term trend that created both wealth inequality and social instability. Rural life was quiet compared to the city, but no less hard. Farmers woke before dawn and worked until exhaustion, ploughing with oxen, planting by hand, harvesting with sickles, threshing grain with flails, pressing grapes and olives, all required intense physical labor. Enslaved agricultural workers had it worse, driven to work harder and longer with brutal punishment for failing to meet expectations. The rural landscape we might romanticize as peaceful was actually a site of hard labor and human suffering. The changing seasons shaped everything about rural life: spring planting, summer tending, fall harvest, winter relative rest, but still with animals to care for and equipment to repair. Romans didn't have detailed weather forecasting beyond watching clouds and learning seasonal patterns. A late freeze could kill fruit blossoms. A dry summer could ruin the harvest. Too much rain at the wrong time could cause flooding or rot. Every year was a gamble with nature, and sometimes nature won, leaving communities facing starvation. Religion in the countryside had a different character from city religion. Local shrines to agricultural deities, to spirits of springs and groves, to household gods. These local cults had deep roots, sometimes predating Rome's dominance. They persisted alongside official Roman religion, creating a complex landscape of belief and practice. A farmer might make offerings to Mars for military success because Rome expected it. but also make private offerings to local deities tied to specific fields or water sources, because that's what his ancestors had always done. Superstition was, if anything, stronger in the countryside. Signs and portents everywhere. If a crow flew to your left, bad luck. If you saw a snake near your house, that meant something, either good or bad depending on the type and direction. The first thunder of spring had to be acknowledged with proper ritual. Crossing a threshold with your left foot first would bring misfortune. These beliefs were passed down through generations and followed religiously, pun intended, because why risk angering the spirits or gods by ignoring the old ways? Seasonal festivals marked the agricultural year. Lupercalia in February was about purification and fertility before spring planting. Lupercalia in April sought protection from wheat rust, a fungal disease that could destroy grain crops. Vernalia in late August celebrated the grape harvest and thanked Jupiter for his blessing. These weren't just religious observances. They were community events that brought people together, broke up the monotony of labor, and reinforced social bonds. The relationship between city and countryside was fundamentally exploitative. Cities consumed resources that rural areas produced, often through taxation and rents that extracted wealth from farmers to support urban populations. Those farmers saw little benefit in return. The roads were primarily for military and commercial traffic. The aqueducts brought water to cities, not to farms that had to make do with wells and streams. The benefits of empire flowed to urban centers, while rural areas bore much of the cost. Yet rural people were citizens too, if they were free Romans, and they sometimes made their voices heard. When grain prices spiked or taxes became unbearable, rural communities could protest or even revolt. These revolts were usually suppressed violently, but the threat was real enough that authorities had to at least pretend to care about rural grievances. The grain dole in Rome was partly about keeping the urban mob pacified, but it was also about providing a market for grain producers and keeping rural economies functioning. Mining in the Roman Empire deserves attention, because it was crucial to the economy and absolutely horrific for those involved. Rome needed metals, gold and silver for coins, iron for weapons and tools, tin and copper for bronze, lead for pipes and water infrastructure. Mines across the empire extracted these resources using primarily slave labor, working in conditions that were essentially death sentences. Imagine being sent to the mines. You're lowered into dark shafts, sometimes hundreds of feet deep, with only oil lamps for light. The air is full of dust that you breathe constantly, slowly destroying your lungs. You chip away at rock face with iron tools, loading ore into baskets that are hauled to the surface. The work is exhausting, the conditions suffocating, and accidents are common. Cave-ins crush miners, flooding drowns them, poisonous gases kill them. Most miners died within months or a few years at most. The Rio Tinto mines in Spain show evidence of Roman mining operations so extensive they've shaped the landscape even today. Romans used hydraulic mining, diverting rivers and streams to wash away soil and expose ore-bearing rock. The environmental destruction was massive. Whole hillsides were carved away. Rivers ran orange-red with contamination. The local ecology was destroyed for centuries. But Rome got the metals it needed, and the human and environmental costs were externalities nobody in power cared about. Lead mining specifically has left a lasting record. Ice cores from Greenland show lead pollution peaks during the Roman period, from atmospheric deposition of lead particles spread across the Mediterranean from mining and smelting operations. The Romans were poisoning themselves with lead on a massive scale. Lead pipes for water, lead cooking vessels, lead cosmetics, lead sweetener added to wine. Chronic lead exposure causes brain damage, kidney damage, reproductive problems, and a host of other health issues. How much lead poisoning contributed to Rome's problems is debatable, but it certainly didn't help. Quarrying for building stone was another brutal industry. Marble from Greece and elsewhere, granite from Egypt, tufa and travertine from Italy itself, all had to be cut from living rock, shaped into massive blocks and transported hundreds or thousands of miles. The quarries were worked by slaves and convicts, condemned to back-breaking labor under the sun. Cutting blocks with iron tools, moving them with simple machines like levers and rollers, loading them onto carts or ships. Every monumental building in Rome represented countless hours of human suffering in distant quarries. The class of workers called the collegiati organized into professional associations, collegiae, for mutual support and social standing. These weren't unions in any modern sense. They couldn't negotiate wages or working conditions, but they provided death benefits for members, organized festivals, and gave craftsmen some collective identity. Bakers had a collegiae, fullers who cleaned cloth had a collegiae, merchants had collegiae, organized by what they traded. Belonging meant you were part of a community, not just an isolated worker. Professional specialization in Rome was surprisingly advanced. You didn't just have builders, you had specialized masons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, each with their own skills and tools. You didn't just have merchants, you had grain merchants, wine merchants, cloth merchants, slave dealers, each specializing in particular commodities. You didn't just have craftsmen, you had specific types of metal workers, leather workers, potters, each making particular products. This specialization created efficiency, but also vulnerability. If you were a specialized worker and demand for your particular skill dropped, you couldn't easily shift to something else. If you were a baker and grain became too expensive, you might go out of business. If you made specific types of tools and demand shifted, your skills became worthless. The economy was sophisticated, but also precarious for individual workers who couldn't easily adapt to changing conditions. Debt was a constant trap. If you borrowed money and couldn't repay it, your creditor could enslave you or your family. This happened. People borrowed to survive bad years or to invest in businesses, and when they couldn't repay, they lost everything. The interest rates could be extortionate, especially for risky loans to poor borrowers. Some money lenders were predatory, deliberately trapping people in debt cycles they could never escape. The legal system nominally protected debtors somewhat, but in practice, wealth and power usually prevailed. Patronage networks were how you survived economically. If you weren't independently wealthy, you attached yourself to a patron, someone wealthier and more powerful, and provided services, political support, skilled work, deference, whatever they needed. In return, they provided protection, financial help in emergencies, connections to opportunities. The system worked if you had a good patron. If your patron fell from power or died without arranging for you to transfer to another patron, you were in trouble. These patron-client relationships extended far beyond simple economics. Your patron might support your family, help arrange marriages for your children, represent you in legal matters, or intervene with authorities on your behalf. You in turn would be at their house for the morning salutatio, vote how they wanted, spread favorable rumors about them, and generally support their political and social goals. It was reciprocal, but unequal. The patron always had the power. Extended family networks provided additional support. Cousins, uncles, in-laws, all were potential sources of help or obligation. But these networks also created endless complications. Family feuds, inheritance disputes, obligation to support relatives you didn't like, pressure to conform to family expectations. The tight social bonds that provided security also constrained individual freedom and choice. Reputation, dignitas, was everything in Roman society. Once lost, it was nearly impossible to recover. A woman caught in adultery was socially destroyed. A man exposed in a humiliating scandal might as well leave Rome. A family tainted by one member's crimes carried that stain for generations. Maintaining reputation required constant vigilance, careful behavior, and strategic management of how you were perceived. Social death could be as devastating as physical death. The honor culture meant insults had to be avenged, or you lost status. If someone publicly insulted you and you did nothing, you were weak. But if you responded with violence, you risked legal consequences. If you responded with a lawsuit, you were petty. The right response depended on circumstances, your relative status, and social context. Navigating honor culture was complex and treacherous. Dueling didn't exist in the formalized way it would in later European societies, but personal violence to settle disputes was common. Two men might fight in the street over an insult, with bystanders watching. Sometimes these fights were fatal. The law would theoretically prosecute you for murder, but if the circumstances made it look like a fair fight between social equals, you might face no real consequences. Self-defense and honor killings occupied murky legal territory, where actual enforcement depended heavily on who you were. So that's what we haven't covered yet about daily Roman life: the criminal justice system's inequalities, the exploitation of natural resources and human beings, the professional organization and economic vulnerability, the web of social obligations and honor codes, the complexity beneath the surface grandeur. Rome was a civilization built on contradictions: advanced engineering alongside primitive medicine, sophisticated literature alongside brutal entertainment, legal principles alongside arbitrary cruelty, the capacity to create beauty and the willingness to inflict suffering. These contradictions weren't bugs in the system, they were the system. They're what made Rome both admirable and horrifying, fascinating and repellent. What's remarkable is that this system persisted for so long and shaped so much of what came after. The Roman Empire as a political entity eventually fell, but Roman influence never did. The laws, the language, the architecture, the ideas, all of it persisted, transformed and spread. We're still dealing with Roman concepts and Roman precedents. The word civilization itself comes from Latin. Our understanding of what it means to be civilized versus barbaric traces directly to Roman categories. Whether that's good or not is worth questioning. The Romans saw themselves as bringing civilization to barbarians, bringing order to chaos, but that civilization was built on slavery, conquest, and exploitation. The order required tremendous violence to impose and maintain. Modern empires have used similar rhetoric to justify similar actions, consciously or unconsciously following Roman precedents. Understanding Roman reality, not the propaganda version, helps us think more critically about how power works and what civilization actually costs. The fall of Rome, which we haven't reached yet in our narrative but everyone knows is coming eventually, wasn't a simple story of barbarians at the gates. It was a long, complex process of transformation, where the empire gradually changed into something else. Some historians argue it never really fell, just evolved into medieval European kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire. Others see the collapse of centralized Roman authority in the West as a genuine catastrophic failure. Both perspectives capture part of the truth. But from inside Rome in 165 AD, none of that is visible. The empire seems eternal, powerful, unshakable. Problems exist, certainly: the plague, the wars, the economic strains. But Rome has always had problems and always overcome them. Citizens in 165 AD have no way to know they're living through what future historians will identify as the beginning of Rome's long decline. They're just living their lives, dealing with their immediate concerns, trying to survive and maybe thrive in the world they inherited. That's always true of people living through historical moments. We can see patterns and trends looking backward with centuries of hindsight. But people in the moment just see daily life, short-term problems, immediate choices. The big historical narratives only become visible later. History isn't just about big events and famous people. It's about all the ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. The baker making bread before dawn, the mother nursing a sick child, the soldier standing guard on a frontier fort, the slave cleaning their master's house, the merchant calculating profits, the old woman remembering when she was young. All of them were just people, just like us, doing their best with what they had. And when we look at their world, we should feel both grateful we don't live in it and humbled by how much they endured. Grateful for modern medicine that would have seemed like magic to them, for political systems that, however imperfect, don't rely on slavery and dictatorship, for technology that makes life easier in countless ways, for social progress that has expanded rights and dignity to more people, but also humbled by the reminder that they were us, that we're not fundamentally smarter or more moral, that we have advantages they lacked but face challenges they never imagined, that our civilization will someday be ancient history too, studied by future people who will judge us by standards we can't anticipate. that the lessons of history aren't simple or easy, and applying them requires wisdom we don't always possess. Rome's story is humanity's story on a grand scale. The achievements and failures, the beauty and horror, the rise and eventual transformation. Understanding it helps us understand ourselves, our world, and maybe make slightly better choices going forward. Or at least it gives us perspective on how hard those choices actually are, and how even smart, sophisticated people can build systems that seem obviously wrong to later generations but felt necessary and natural to them. Let's continue exploring more of what made Rome Rome, because there's always more to discover, more to understand, more complexity beneath what we thought we knew. Language in Rome was more complex than you might think. Latin was the official language, but most of the empire spoke Greek in the eastern provinces. Educated Romans were bilingual, speaking both Latin and Greek fluently. Greek was the language of philosophy, medicine, and high culture. If you wanted to seem sophisticated, you dropped Greek phrases into conversation, the ancient equivalent of using French in English. Poor Romans in the city spoke a colloquial Latin full of slang and vulgarisms that would have horrified grammar teachers. This vulgar Latin would eventually evolve into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, but in 165 AD, it was just how regular people talked. Regional accents existed and were mocked. Romans could tell where you came from by how you spoke Latin. A thick Gaulish accent marked you as provincial. An Egyptian-speaking heavily accented Latin was subject to contempt. Even within Italy, northern accents differed from southern ones, and city people mocked rural speech patterns. Linguistic prejudice reinforced social hierarchies and regional stereotypes. The right way to speak Latin was the educated Roman patrician accent, and anything else marked you as lower class or foreign. Written Latin looked different from what we imagine. No spaces between words, no punctuation in the modern sense, all capital letters. You would be reading text that looked like this, and you'd have to figure out where words began and ended from context. This made reading slower and more difficult, which is part of why literacy rates were low. Learning to read fluently required years of practice, and most people never got that education. Graffiti in Pompeii shows us how ordinary Romans actually wrote when they weren't trying to be formal. Spelling errors, slang, obscene jokes, political slogans, personal messages. One famous Pompeii graffito reads, "Everyone writes on the walls but me," which is funny because that person just wrote on the wall to say they don't write on walls. Another says, "Weep, you girls, my penis has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds." The writer was apparently announcing he'd switched his sexual preferences and felt the need to inform the public via bathroom wall. Romans were just people, sometimes crude, sometimes funny, just like us. Numbers written in Roman numerals weren't just displayed, they were used for accounting and commerce constantly, but they're terrible for arithmetic. Quick, multiply XL15 by LXX3. Now try it in Arabic numerals. 47 times 83 is much easier to calculate. Romans used counting boards, abacuses, and tables of pre-calculated values to work around the limitations of their number system. The fact that they built their entire civilization using such an inefficient numbering system is actually impressive, though it definitely held back mathematical development. Education for the wealthy included oratory training that shaped how elite Romans thought and argued. You learned to argue both sides of any question. You memorized vast amounts of poetry and prose. You practiced delivery, gesture, voice modulation, all the performance aspects of public speaking. Roman education was about turning you into a persuasive public performer, not necessarily about critical thinking or learning practical skills. This meant elite Romans were often brilliant speakers who could argue any position convincingly, whether or not they actually believed it. The legal training aristocrats received was practical education in manipulating the system. You learnt the laws, but also the loopholes, the precedents, the ways to interpret statutes in your favor. Roman law was sophisticated, but also gameable if you had resources and knowledge. Wealthy defendants could hire skilled lawyers who'd find technical defenses or procedural problems to get charges dismissed. Poor defendants had no such options and faced the full weight of the law with no ability to navigate its complexities. Rhetoric classes included controversial thesis debates. These hypothetical cases trained students to construct arguments from first principles, but they also normalized certain assumptions about power and law that we might find troubling. The education system reinforced hierarchical thinking while teaching skills that could be used to defend almost any position. Philosophy was taken seriously by some educated Romans, but was also something people claimed to follow without actually living by. Many aristocrats called themselves Stoics while living lives of luxury and political scheming that violated Stoic principles. Epicureanism was often misunderstood as hedonism, when Epicurus actually taught moderate pleasure and withdrawal from public life. The actual philosophies were complex, but many Romans used them as social markers more than genuine life philosophies. Marcus Aurelius was unusual in actually trying to live his Stoic philosophy while serving as emperor. His meditations, written in Greek to himself during military campaigns, show him wrestling with the gap between Stoic ideals and reality. He writes about patience, acceptance, duty, mortality, and trying to be a good person in a world full of injustice and suffering. He was doing this while waging wars, dealing with plague, managing an empire, and slowly watching his son Commodus, who would become emperor after him, show signs of being unsuited for power. The philosophy helped him cope, but couldn't prevent the disasters that would follow his death. Marcus Aurelius's relationship with Commodus is one of history's tragic ironies. Marcus was the philosopher king, the ideal ruler. Commodus became one of the worst emperors, a narcissist who spent imperial resources on gladiatorial games where he fought himself, always winning because who's going to kill the emperor, even in a supposedly fair contest? Marcus's insistence on making Commodus his heir, rather than adopting a better candidate as previous emperors had done, broke the chain of competent rulers and contributed to the empire's troubles. Even wise men make terrible decisions sometimes. The 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, had given Rome nearly a century of relative stability and prosperity. This wasn't because they were elected, or because the system had improved. It was mostly luck that each emperor either had no biological son, or chose to adopt a capable successor, rather than elevating an incompetent relative. Once Marcus broke this pattern by making his biological son heir, the luck ran out. Commodus's disastrous rule would lead to civil war, and Rome would never quite recover the stability of the Antonine period. But again, Marcus in 165 AD doesn't know this. He's trying his best to be a good emperor, deal with the plague, fight the Germanic tribes, and hold the empire together. He writes in his meditations that you can't control outcomes, only your own responses, that you should focus on doing your duty regardless of results. He's following his own advice, not knowing that his greatest failure might be his inability to recognize his son's unsuitability for power or to do anything about it. The imperial succession problem haunted Rome throughout its history. No stable system for transferring power existed. Emperors were made by acclamation of the legions, confirmation by the Senate, and acceptance by the Praetorian Guard, but the balance between these forces was always unstable. A strong emperor could designate a successor, but that successor had to be accepted by the military and Senate, or civil war would follow. This meant imperial politics were constantly treacherous, with plots, assassinations, and violence never far beneath the surface. Emperors lived under constant threat. Many were assassinated. Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Domitian, and many others died violently at the hands of conspirators. Even beloved emperors feared plots. You couldn't trust anyone completely. Your food might be poisoned. Your guards might turn on you. A senator smiling at you might be planning your death. The stress and paranoia of imperial power drove some emperors mad, or made them cruel as they tried to eliminate threats preemptively. The Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to protect the emperor, were often the ones who killed him when they decided someone else would pay better. They were mercenaries with delusions of grandeur, kingmakers who could make or break emperors. Keeping them loyal required constant bribes. Donatives paid when a new emperor took power, bonuses on special occasions, higher base pay than regular legionaries, If you failed to keep the praetorians happy, they might decide to replace you with someone more generous. The Senate, though less powerful than in Republican days, still represented the aristocratic class and had to be managed. Emperors who ignored or insulted the Senate faced conspiracies led by senators. Emperors who tried to court senatorial support often found themselves trapped by senatorial politics and factional games. The balance was delicate, and different emperors handled it differently. Some, like Augustus, worked carefully to maintain the fiction that the Senate still mattered. Others, like Caligula, openly mocked senators and humiliated them for entertainment. Provincial governors had enormous power in their territories and could be threats if they commanded legions. A popular general with loyal troops could march on Rome and seize power, as had happened repeatedly during the Republic and would happen again in the empire's future. Emperors rotated governors regularly, kept potential rivals under surveillance, and sometimes executed or exiled those who seemed too popular with their troops. The paranoia was justified because the threat was real. Women in the imperial family could be powerful but also vulnerable. An emperor's wife, mother, sister, or daughter had unofficial influence but no official power. If they were widowed or if the emperor died, their position became precarious. Some, like Livia, Augustus's wife, maintained influence across multiple reigns. Others, like Messalina, Claudius's wife, were executed for plotting or scandalous behavior. Imperial women played a dangerous game, wielding power through relationships while having no independent authority. The imperial household was massive, with thousands of slaves and freedmen handling administration. These household servants often had more real power than senators, because they controlled access to the emperor and managed day-to-day government business. Freedmen, secretaries, accountants, and advisors could become extremely wealthy and influential. Senators resented being subordinate to former slaves, but the system worked, and emperors trusted their household staff more than the aristocrats constantly scheming for advantage. Palace intrigue was constant. Who was in favor? Who was out? Which faction was ascendant? Which was falling? Rumors swirled continuously. Someone seen meeting with the emperor privately became subject to intense speculation. Someone who'd been prominent, suddenly disappearing from court, meant either they'd fallen from grace or were plotting. Everyone was watching everyone else, trying to read the signals and position themselves advantageously. Living at court must have been exhausting and terrifying. One wrong word, one perceived insult, one failure to show proper deference, and you could find yourself accused of treason. The atmosphere combined the worst aspects of high school social politics with life or death consequences. People smile at you while planning your destruction. Your friends might betray you to save themselves. The emperor's favor is everything, but it's fickle and can be withdrawn for no reason you understand. Yet people desperately sought positions at court because that's where power and wealth were. Being in the emperor's circle meant access to opportunities, lucrative positions, advancement for your family, and protection from enemies. The risks were enormous, but so were the potential rewards. Many took the gamble, and many lost. Away from court politics, most Romans never met the emperor and didn't care much about palace intrigue beyond gossip. They cared about bread prices, whether their street would be cleaned, if the games would be good this month, local politics, and personal drama. The emperor was a distant figure, important in abstract ways, but not part of daily life for regular people. As long as grain kept flowing and taxes didn't increase too much, most Romans didn't pay attention to who was actually emperor. This disconnect between elite politics and ordinary life is important to understand. We focus on emperors and senators and wars because those are what sources document, but the vast majority of Romans lived lives that were barely touched by these great events except indirectly. A poor shopkeeper in Rome cared more about whether customers were buying his goods than about which patrician family was feuding with which other patrician family. The political class was tiny, perhaps a few thousand families across the empire, out of a population of 50 to 70 million. These were the people who wrote histories, gave speeches, made laws, commanded armies, governed provinces. For them, politics was everything. For everyone else, politics was distant background noise that occasionally became relevant when it affected taxes or conscription, or caused civil war that disrupted your region. This is always true in history. The documented story focuses on elites because they left written records. The actual story includes millions of undocumented people whose lives went unrecorded. We know about Julius Caesar's assassination in incredible detail. We know almost nothing about the thousands of people who died in Rome of disease or violence or accident the same year. Their deaths mattered enormously to their families, but didn't make it into histories. Trying to understand the full reality of Roman life means imagining all those undocumented lives. The slave woman who cooked meals for her master's family and never had her name recorded. The soldier who died in some frontier skirmish that didn't make it into histories. The child who survived to adulthood against the odds and lived an unremarkable but fully human life. The merchant who made a comfortable living and died surrounded by family. These people were Rome as much as emperors were, maybe more so, because there were millions of them. Every person in Rome had an inner life as complex as ours. They had thoughts, feelings, dreams, fears, loves, hatreds, hopes. They wondered about their purpose, worried about their future, remembered their past. They experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and loneliness. All of this is lost, except in rare glimpses when someone writes something down that survives. This is the tragedy of history. We've lost almost everything. For every document that survives, thousands were destroyed. For every story told, millions went untold. We're working with fragments, trying to reconstruct a whole civilization from incomplete evidence. Historians do remarkable work piecing together the puzzle, but huge gaps remain and always will. We'll never know what we don't know about Rome. What we do know comes from biased sources. Elite men wrote the histories that survived, so we see the world through their perspectives. Slaves, women, children, the poor. Their views are filtered through how elite men portrayed them. Sometimes we can read between the lines, question the sources, find hints of other perspectives, but mostly we're stuck with the viewpoint of a narrow segment of society. This is why archaeology is so valuable. Physical remains don't lie about their perspective. A slave's shackles tell us something histories might not mention. A child's tombstone shows us parental grief unfiltered by political concerns. Graffiti reveals what ordinary people thought in their own words. The remains of a meal tell us what people actually ate, not what literary sources claim they ate. Physical evidence keeps us honest. Pompeii is extraordinary because it's a snapshot of daily life frozen in time. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, the ash buried everything, preserving buildings, objects, even the shapes of bodies in the ash. We can see houses exactly as they were when people fled. We can read graffiti scrawled days before the eruption. We can examine bread that was in ovens when disaster struck. No other site gives us such an intimate view of ordinary Roman life. The tragedy of Pompeii reminds us that Romans faced dangers we barely think about. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis. Natural disasters struck without warning and killed indiscriminately. The morning Vesuvius erupted, thousands of people woke up planning ordinary days. By evening, many were dead or fleeing for their lives. By the next day, 2 towns were buried under volcanic debris. Nature could end your life instantly, and there was nothing you could do about it. Earthquakes were common in the Mediterranean, and devastating when they struck. Buildings collapsed, killing people trapped inside. Fires started from overturned lamps and braziers, spreading through rubble. Aftershocks continued for days, terrifying survivors and preventing rescue efforts. The earthquake that hit Pompeii in 62 AD damaged much of the city, and it was still being repaired when Vesuvius erupted 17 years later. Many buildings that collapsed in the eruption had been weakened by earlier earthquake damage. Climate-related disasters became more common as the Roman climate optimum ended. Droughts led to crop failures and famines. Floods destroyed farmland and infrastructure. Unusually cold winters or late frosts killed crops. Romans had no way to predict weather patterns or mitigate agricultural disasters. When harvests failed, people starved, and there was no global relief system to help. Communities had to rely on stored grain, which might not exist, or on government and private charity, which was never sufficient. Disease remained the constant killer. Beyond the major plagues, Endemic diseases killed steadily: malaria in marshy areas, dysentery from contaminated water, tuberculosis in crowded urban spaces, various fevers that killed children especially. Romans accepted high disease mortality, the way we accept traffic accidents, tragic but inevitable, just part of life's risks. They took precautions that seemed sensible but were often ineffective because they didn't understand disease transmission. The helplessness against disease must have been psychologically devastating. Watching a child die of a fever and being unable to help beyond giving water and prayer. Seeing a spouse waste away from tuberculosis over months. Surviving plague when friends and neighbors died. Wondering why you were spared. Medical knowledge couldn't explain, couldn't predict, couldn't cure. You just endured and hoped. This brings us back to religion and why it mattered so much. Religion provided explanations, however inadequate. The gods controlled fate, and if you performed the right rituals, you might gain their favor. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but it was something, some sense of agency in a world that otherwise seemed randomly cruel. Even if it didn't actually work, the ritual actions gave people something to do, some way to feel they were addressing the problem. Prayer, sacrifice, vows to gods, all were attempts to negotiate with divine powers for better outcomes. If your child was sick, you'd promise a sacrifice to Asclepius if the child recovered. If you survived battle, you'd fulfill vows made before the fight. These weren't signs of primitive superstition, they were rational responses to real problems when no other solutions existed. We should be careful not to condescend to Roman religious beliefs when our ancestors believed similar things until very recently, and when some people still do. The philosophical question Romans grappled with was how to live well in a world full of suffering and uncertainty. Stoicism taught acceptance of what you can't control and focus on virtue. Epicureanism taught withdrawal from stress and cultivation of simple pleasures. Both were attempting to find peace and happiness despite harsh realities. That these philosophies developed and flourished in the ancient world shows that Romans faced the same existential questions we do, sought the same sense of meaning and purpose. Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations asks himself how to remain good in a corrupt world, how to do your duty when outcomes are uncertain, how to accept mortality without fear, how to deal with people you find frustrating or immoral. These are timeless questions. His answers, rooted in Stoicism, emphasize acceptance, duty, virtue, and recognizing that you control only your responses, not events. It's thoughtful, and often moving. This philosophical emperor writing to himself while leading armies and managing an empire. But philosophy couldn't save Rome from its problems. It couldn't cure plague, or stop Germanic invasions, or fix economic issues, or prevent political instability. Philosophy helped individuals cope, but couldn't solve societal challenges. This is always the limitation of purely philosophical or spiritual approaches to problems that require practical material solutions. You can be stoic about plague, accepting it with equanimity, but that doesn't stop plague from killing millions. The gap between individual and collective challenges is something Rome never solved. Individuals could be virtuous, but the system remained exploitative and violent. Good emperors could rule justly, but the imperial system itself was fundamentally autocratic and unstable. Wise philosophy could make people better, but society continued to depend on slavery and conquest. These contradictions were built into Roman civilization and couldn't be resolved without transforming the entire system, which eventually happened through the long, messy process of Rome's transformation into medieval Europe. Looking at Rome from our perspective, we can see the flaws clearly. Slavery was wrong, gender inequality was wrong, autocracy was dangerous, the gladiatorial games were cruel, the exploitation of provinces was unjust, military conquest destroyed cultures and killed millions. All of this is obvious to us now, but Romans, even thoughtful ones, generally couldn't see it or didn't care. The system worked for those with power, and that was sufficient justification. This should make us humble about our own moral blind spots. Future people will look back at our time and see obvious injustices we're too embedded in our system to recognize. They'll wonder how we could have been so blind to problems that will seem apparent to them. This is how history works. Every era has assumptions that seem natural and inevitable to people living through them but appear bizarre or horrifying to later generations. So what can we learn from Rome? Not simple lessons, not empires always fall or slavery is wrong, which are true but too easy. The deeper lessons are about complexity, about how sophisticated civilizations can contain terrible injustices, about how ordinary people participate in and perpetuate systems they don't fully understand, about how individual virtue doesn't automatically create collective justice. Rome teaches us that humans are capable of both extraordinary achievements and terrible cruelties, often simultaneously, that civilization is built on foundations we prefer not to examine too closely, that progress is neither inevitable nor linear, that what seems eternal can crumble, sometimes slowly over centuries, sometimes catastrophically in a single generation, that the people who come after will judge us by standards we can't predict and might not accept. It also teaches us that people across time are fundamentally similar. Romans loved, grieved, hoped, feared, struggled, and endured just as we do. Their circumstances were different, but their humanity was identical. This is why studying history matters. Not to memorize dates and names, but to understand the full range of human experience, to recognize our connection to all the people who came before, to gain perspective on our own time and place. You've spent tonight walking through ancient Rome in considerable detail. You've seen the grandeur of monuments and the squalor of tenements. You've visited the forum and the slums, the palace and the insulae, the baths and the latrines. You've met emperors and slaves, soldiers and merchants, philosophers and laborers. You've experienced the noise, the smell, the crowds, the violence, the disease, the spectacle, the daily grinding difficulty of just surviving. You've learned what they ate, how they dressed, where they slept, how they worked, what they believed, how they died. You've seen the inequality, the cruelty, the exploitation, but also the humanity, the love, the endurance, the remarkable achievements. You've witnessed a civilization at its height, confident in its power, unaware that its greatest challenges still lay ahead. And through all of this, you've hopefully gained some appreciation for how extraordinary it is that you're alive now rather than then, that you can take antibiotics if you get an infection, that you can turn on a light with a switch instead of fumbling with oil lamps, that you can communicate instantly across the world, instead of waiting months for a letter that might never arrive, that you have rights and freedoms that most Romans never imagined, that you can expect to live into your 70s or 80s instead of dying at 40, but also hopefully you've recognized your connection to those Romans, that your comfort depends on systems and labor you don't see, just as theirs did, that our civilization has its own injustices and blind spots just as theirs did, that we're not fundamentally different people, just luckier in when and where we were born, that the lessons of history are really lessons about ourselves, seen in a mirror that reflects across 2,000 years. Rome fell, or transformed, or evolved. Historians still debate the right word, but its influence never died. You're reading this in a language influenced by Latin. You live under laws descended from Roman legal principles. Your architecture echoes Roman buildings. Your concept of empire, citizenship, republic, civilization, all are shaped by Roman ideas. The calendar you use is Roman. The months are named after Roman gods and emperors. Even the structure of Western education traces back to Roman models. So Rome isn't really past. It's layered into the present, invisible but pervasive, like geological strata beneath our modern world. Understanding Rome means understanding the foundations we're building on, the assumptions we've inherited, the patterns that keep repeating because we never fully escaped Roman precedents. That's the final takeaway from tonight's journey. History isn't separate from the present. It's woven into everything we are, everything we think, everything we've built. The past isn't dead. It's not even past, to borrow Faulkner's phrase. It lives in us, shapes us, constrains and enables us in ways we rarely recognize. The Romans in 165 AD didn't know they were ancient history to future people. They were just living their lives, dealing with their present, trying to get through the day. We're doing the same thing, not realizing that someday we'll be ancient history too, studied by people trying to understand how we could have been so blind to things that will seem obvious to them. That's humbling and also oddly comforting. We're part of the human story, the long chain of people trying their best with what they have, sometimes succeeding, often failing, always learning, always adapting. The Romans were one chapter. We're another. There will be many more, if we're lucky and wise enough to survive our own challenges. So that's ancient Rome, not the marble statues and noble speeches of Hollywood, not the simple story of rise and fall, the real complicated, messy, brutal, beautiful, very human reality of a million people living in the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen, at the heart of an empire that thought itself eternal, but was already beginning its long transformation into something else. You've made it through tonight's journey into the past. You've seen a world utterly different from yours, but inhabited by people fundamentally the same. You've witnessed the best and worst of human civilization, the achievements and the atrocities, the grandeur and the suffering. You've gained, I hope, some perspective on how fortunate you are to live when you do, and some humility about how similar we remain to our ancestors despite all our technological progress. Thanks for spending this time with me, exploring what life was really like in ancient Rome. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what historical topic you'd like me to explore next. Your suggestions and support make these videos possible, and I'm grateful for everyone who joins me on these nighttime journeys through time. Now it's time to let all these images and ideas settle into your mind. Let yourself drift off thinking about the Forum at sunrise, the Colosseum packed with spectators, the aqueducts marching across the countryside, the insulae rising into the Roman sky. Imagine what it would have been like to live in that world, so different from ours, yet filled with people just like us, trying to make their way through lives that were often hard, but also filled with moments of joy, connection, and meaning. Close your eyes and rest. You've traveled 2,000 years back in time tonight, and returned safely to your comfortable modern bed. Let the fascinating details and the human stories carry you into peaceful sleep. Dream of ancient streets and marble temples, of ordinary Romans living extraordinary lives in a civilization that shaped everything that came after. Sleep well. Good night.